I'll never forget the moment my father pointed at me across the Christmas party and said those words that would change everything. "Oh, that's Chelsea, she's just our housekeeper." The room went quiet. I stood there in my apron holding a tray of glasses while his business colleagues nodded politely. Then my mother, the woman I'd called Mom for 22 years, added with a cruel laugh, "We only keep her here out of pity, but honestly, she's quite good with a mop." Polite chuckles rippled through the crowd. I felt that familiar shame wash over me, the same shame I'd felt my entire childhood, being treated like a servant in my own home, while my younger brother Justin was treated like royalty. But this time was different. Because standing in that room was David Whitmore, the CEO my father was desperately trying to impress, hoping to secure a job for my useless brother. The most powerful man in the room. The man my family had spent weeks preparing to meet. What they didn't know was that David Whitmore was also my boss. The man I'd worked with for 6 months. The man who knew exactly who I really was. When my father introduced me as the housekeeper, David's expression turned to stone. He stared at my parents with eyes colder than I'd ever seen and said 5 words that made the blood drain from their faces. "Really, I know exactly who she is." What happened in the next 60 seconds destroyed my family's lives forever. But that was just the beginning. Because hidden in my past was a secret worth $8 million, a secret my family had buried for over 20 years. And when the truth came out, it didn't just humiliate them, it annihilated them. This is the story of how I got everything they tried to steal from me and so much more. I was 7 years old the first time I understood I wasn't really part of my own family. It wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 small cuts that eventually bled into one undeniable truth. In the Patterson household, I was labor, not love. Chelsea's role as the family servant. I was 7 years old the first time I realized I didn't belong in my own family. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no shouting, no violence. Just a quiet morning when my mother handed me a basket of laundry that was almost as big as I was and said, "Get this done before school, Chelsea, and make sure you pack Justin's lunch too." My name is Chelsea Patterson, or at least that's the name I grew up with. And this is the story of how I discovered everything about my life was built on a lie. Justin was 5. He sat at the kitchen table eating the pancakes I'd helped make at 6 a.m., his feet swinging happily while he watched cartoons. He didn't have chores. He didn't have responsibilities. He had childhood. I had work. The Patterson household in our modest Ohio neighborhood looked normal from the outside, a 2-story colonial with a neat lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway. But inside those walls, I learned early that my worth was measured only by what I could do, not who I was. Every morning started the same way. I'd wake up at 5:30 to start breakfast, make sure Justin's school clothes were laid out, and get a head start on whatever cleaning my mother had assigned me the night before. Laundry, dishes, vacuuming, dusting, if it needed doing, it was my job. "It's a girl's natural duty," my mother would say whenever I looked tired or tried to suggest that maybe Justin could help sometimes. "You should be grateful we give you a roof over your head, Chelsea. Some children aren't so lucky." I was 7 years old, and I was being told to be grateful for the basic necessities of life. My father was even more direct. He rarely spoke to me except to give instructions or criticize. "You missed a spot on the floor. Justin's shirt isn't ironed properly. Why is dinner late?" Every interaction was transactional. I existed to serve, and he existed to judge whether I was doing it well enough. The work itself wasn't what broke me, though it was exhausting for a child. It was the invisibility of it all. No one ever said thank you. No one ever acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, a second grader shouldn't be responsible for an entire household while also trying to keep up with schoolwork. But I learned quickly. I learned to move quietly through the house, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible. I learned that love, if it existed at all in that house, was conditional, and I hadn't yet figured out the conditions. The emotional neglect cut deeper than any amount of physical work ever could. Because while I was scrubbing floors and folding laundry, my younger brother Justin was living an entirely different childhood, one filled with the warmth and attention I desperately craved, but never received. Justin's life was a parade of celebrations for the smallest accomplishments. Lost his first tooth, Dad took him out for ice cream and they came home with a new video game. Got a B on a spelling test, Mom put it on the refrigerator with a gold star and made his favorite dinner. Hit a ball during Little League practice. They bought him expensive new equipment and bragged to the neighbors for weeks. Meanwhile, I brought home straight A's every single report card from first grade onward. Not once did those papers make it to the refrigerator. Not once did anyone take me out to celebrate. "That's what we expect from you, Chelsea," my mother said dismissively the one time I dared to show her a perfect score on a difficult math test. "You're a girl. You're supposed to be good at school since you won't have much else." The message was clear. My achievements were invisible because they were expected. Justin's were extraordinary because he was special. When Justin broke things, and he broke a lot of things, it was always dismissed with an indulgent smile. "Boys will be boys." My father would chuckle, ruffling Justin's hair while I cleaned up whatever mess he'd made. A broken lamp spilled juice-torn books. None of it mattered because Justin was just being a spirited, energetic boy. But if I made even the smallest mistake, forgot to separate the dark laundry from the light-served dinner 5 minutes late because I'd been helping Justin with his homework, didn't fold the towels exactly the way my mother preferred, it was evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. "Why are you so careless, Chelsea?" My mother would snap, her disappointment palpable and cutting. "Why can't you do anything right? We ask so little of you." So little. As if the weight of an entire household didn't rest on my small shoulders. The contrast in treatment wasn't subtle. It was glaring, deliberate, and impossible to miss. Even as a child, I understood what it meant Justin was loved unconditionally. I was tolerated conditionally. And the condition was perfection in service, a standard I could never quite meet no matter how hard I tried. I remember lying in bed at night 7 years old and exhausted trying to figure out what was wrong with me. Why didn't my parents look at me the way they looked at Justin? Why didn't my accomplishments matter? Why didn't I matter? The wound that created in my heart never fully healed. Even decades later, I can still feel the echo of that little girl wondering why she wasn't worthy of love. But I learned to survive. I learned to cope. And the way I coped was through silence. Speaking up in the Patterson household was dangerous. I learned that lesson painfully and permanently when I was 8 years old. It was a Saturday morning, and I'd been cleaning the kitchen for an hour while Justin played video games in the living room. I was tired, bone-deep tired in the way only chronic exhaustion can create. I'd been up late the night before finishing laundry, and I still had to mow the lawn, clean the bathrooms, and prepare lunch. Justin had nothing to do, nothing. He'd slept and eaten the breakfast I made and settled in for a day of entertainment. Something in me snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the injustice of it all. But I walked into the living room and asked my father a simple question. "Dad, why doesn't Justin have any chores? Could he maybe help sometimes?" The room went cold. My father slowly turned away from the newspaper he'd been reading and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder. More final. "You're lucky we even keep you here, Chelsea," he said quietly, each word deliberate and cutting. "Don't make us regret our generosity." I was 8 years old, and I'd just been told that my place in my own home was conditional, that I could be discarded if I became too much trouble, too demanding, too much of anything other than grateful and compliant. That phrase, "You're lucky we even keep you here," haunted me for years. It echoed in my head every time I wanted to complain about being tired, every time I wanted to ask for help, every time I wanted to be treated like a child instead of a servant. It taught me that my safety, my security, my very existence in that house depended on my silence and my usefulness. So I stopped asking questions. I stopped complaining. I stopped expecting things to change. I developed a pattern of making myself small and invisible. I learned to move through the house like a ghost, present when needed, absent when not. I learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to solve problems before they were noticed, to exist without taking up space. I believed with the desperate hope that only a child can maintain, that if I was just good enough, helpful enough, perfect enough, maybe one day they would love me too. Maybe one day my father would ruffle my hair the way he did Justin's. Maybe one day my mother would hug me without it feeling like an obligation. Maybe one day I would matter to them the way Justin so obviously did. But that day never came. Years passed, and the pattern only deepened. I grew from a child into a teenager, and my responsibilities grew with me. By the time I was 12, I was doing all the cooking, all the cleaning, managing the household budget, and essentially raising Justin while my parents focused on their careers and social lives. I told myself it was normal. I told myself every family had roles, and this was mine. I told myself that the ache in my chest when I watched other families interact with warmth and affection was just me being ungrateful. I told myself a lot of lies to survive in that house. But deep down, in a place I didn't let myself examine too closely, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. I knew that children weren't supposed to feel like employees in their own homes. I knew that love wasn't supposed to be earned through labor and perfection. I knew I didn't belong there, not really. I just didn't know why. But the real nightmare was just beginning, and it started with a lie I didn't know existed. The verbal abuse didn't start suddenly. It crept in slowly, like water eroding stone, until one day I realized the foundation of my self-worth had been completely worn away. My father had a particular talent for making his contempt sound almost casual. He'd say things like, "You'll never amount to anything," while passing me in the hallway, as if he were commenting on the weather. At the dinner table, when I'd mention a challenging project at school or a goal I was working toward, he'd cut me off mid-sentence with a dismissive wave. "We should have never taken you in. You're more trouble than you're worth." Taken me in. Even then, at 13, 14 years old, those words felt strange. But I was too beaten down to question them, too afraid of the answer to ask what he meant. My mother's cruelty was different, more comparative, designed to highlight everything I wasn't. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became her favorite refrain. It didn't matter that Justin was failing 2 classes while I maintained a 4.0 GPA. It didn't matter that I was responsible, hardworking, and reliable while he was lazy and entitled. In her eyes, he was perfect simply by existing, and I was deficient no matter what I achieved. These weren't occasional outbursts triggered by stress or bad days. They were daily reminders woven into the fabric of every conversation that I was unwanted, unloved, a burden they heroically tolerated. At school, my teachers saw something different. Mrs. Henderson, my English teacher, pulled me aside after class one day during my sophomore year. "Chelsea, you have remarkable analytical skills. Have you thought about applying to advanced placement courses? With your grades, you could probably get into an excellent university." I remember feeling a flutter of hope, fragile and tentative. I went home that evening and mentioned it at dinner, carefully testing the waters. My mother didn't even look up from her plate. "Girls don't need education anyway, Chelsea. You'll get married, have children. College is a waste of money for someone like you." My father nodded in agreement. "Besides, we're spending enough on Justin's future. We can't afford to send both of you to school, and obviously his education is more important." Obviously. As if it were a law of nature that my brother's potential mattered more than mine. The psychological damage accumulated like poison in my system. Each dismissive comment, each comparison, each reminder that I was less than built up until I started to believe them. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was worthless. Maybe the problem wasn't them. Maybe it was me. I began to doubt everything about myself. When teachers praised my work, I assumed they were being kind, not honest. When I did well on tests, I attributed it to luck rather than ability. The confident, curious child I'd once been slowly disappeared, replaced by someone who apologized for existing and expected rejection as a baseline. But even as I internalized their poison, part of me noticed the inconsistencies, the things that didn't quite add up. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, 2 weeks before my 16th birthday. My mother had asked me to deep clean her bedroom while she was at a dental appointment. Dust the furniture vacuum under the bed, organize her closet. Standard tasks I'd done 100 times before. I was working methodically the way I'd learned to do everything when I noticed her nightstand drawer was slightly open. She usually kept it locked, had kept it locked for as long as I could remember. But today, in her rush, she must have forgotten. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it carefully, not sure what I expected to find. Jewelry, maybe. Personal letters. Something mundane. Instead, I found a thick manila envelope yellowed with age tucked beneath some scarves. The logo on the front made my breath catch, Ohio Department of Child and Family Services. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was heavy, stuffed with documents. I was just about to open it when I heard the front door slam. Chelsea. "Where are you?" My mother's voice carried up the stairs sharp with her usual impatience. I barely had time to register the panic in my chest before she appeared in the doorway. Her eyes went immediately to the envelope in my hands. Her face drained of color so quickly, I thought she might faint. "What are you doing?" Her voice was deadly quiet, which was somehow more terrifying than if she'd been screaming. "I was cleaning, and the drawer was open. She crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched the envelope from my hands with such violence that the papers inside rustled. "Don't you dare snoop through my things. Do you understand me? Don't you ever touch this again." I'd seen my mother angry before I'd been on the receiving end of her cold disapproval my entire life. But this was different. This was fear. Raw, desperate fear. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "Get out." She was already shoving the envelope back into the drawer, her hand shaking as she fumbled with the lock. "Get out of my room, now!" I fled, my heart pounding, more confused than frightened. If it was just old paperwork, just some boring documents from years ago, why had she reacted like that? Why the panic in her eyes? Why lock it away so desperately? That envelope became a question mark that haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, turning it over in my mind late at night when sleep wouldn't come. What was in those documents? Why did they involve child and family services? And why was my mother so terrified of me seeing them? The incident shifted something in my perception. I started noticing other oddities I'd unconsciously overlooked for years. I looked nothing like my parents. My mother had light brown hair and green eyes. My father had dark hair and brown eyes. Justin had inherited their coloring perfectly. He looked like a blend of both of them. But I had black hair and dark brown eyes that were almost black features that didn't match anyone in the family. When I was younger, I'd been told I took after some distant relative. But now, looking at family photos with fresh eyes, I couldn't find anyone who resembled me. And speaking of photos, there were almost none of me before age 5. Our house was filled with pictures of Justin from infancy onward, documenting every stage of his life. But my early childhood was a blank space. The oldest photo of me in any family album showed me at what looked like 5 or 6 years old, sitting stiffly on the couch unsmiling. When I casually asked my mother about baby pictures one evening, her response was immediate and sharp. "We lost them in a move." "Why are you asking?" But we'd never moved. We'd lived in this house my entire life, or at least as long as I could remember. Relatives were another strange piece of the puzzle. We didn't have many family gatherings, but when my mother's sister visited or my father's brother stopped by, they were always awkward around me. Not unkind exactly, but uncomfortable. They'd ask Justin about school sports, his friends. They'd barely acknowledge me beyond a polite hello. Once when I was 14, my aunt made a comment to my mother that I wasn't supposed to hear, "She looks so much like..." But my mother cut her off with a sharp look and steered the conversation away immediately. Like who? Who did I look like? The feeling of being an outsider in my own home, which had always existed as a vague emotional truth, crystallized into something more concrete. I didn't just feel like I didn't belong. There was evidence I didn't belong. Late at night, I started hearing my parents argue in their bedroom. Their voices were usually too muffled to make out clearly, but certain phrases would drift down the hallway to my room. We made an agreement. What we promised doesn't matter anymore. If she ever finds out, she won't. We've been careful. I'd lie in my bed straining to hear more, my heart racing. But whenever I asked about it the next day, they'd deny everything. You were dreaming, my mother would say dismissively. We weren't arguing about anything. But I knew what I'd heard. All these pieces, the envelope, the missing photos, my appearance, the relatives' discomfort, the late-night arguments swirled in my mind like puzzle pieces that I couldn't quite fit together. They pointed to some truth I couldn't see clearly, but could feel hovering just beyond my comprehension. Something about my life was fundamentally wrong. Something about my place in this family was based on a lie. I just didn't know what it was yet. That envelope would eventually unlock a truth that would destroy everything they'd built on lies. High school graduation should have been a celebration. I'd finished with a 3.95. GPA, earned honors distinction, and received awards in mathematics and English. My teachers told me I had a bright future ahead. For a few brief weeks, I let myself believe them. Then reality came crashing down with brutal efficiency. 2 days after the ceremony, my parents called me into the living room. My father sat in his usual chair, my mother on the couch. Neither looked at me directly as they delivered the news that would define the next phase of my life. We can't afford to help with college, my father said flatly. You're 18 now. It's time you learn to support yourself. I stood there processing his words while my eyes drifted to the driveway visible through the window. Justin's brand new Honda Civic sat gleaming in the late afternoon sun, the car they'd bought him 3 weeks earlier for his 16th birthday. The car that cost more than 2 years of community college tuition. But Justin, I started. Justin is different, my mother cut me off. He has potential. He needs opportunities. You're a girl, Chelsea. You'll probably just get married anyway. College would be wasted on you. There it was again. That casual dismissal of my worth, my future, my potential, as if my gender erased any claim I had to education or ambition. I didn't argue. I'd learned years ago that arguing was pointless. Instead, I went upstairs, pulled out the 2 suitcases I'd gotten at a thrift store, and started packing. If they wanted me gone, I'd go. I'd been essentially on my own emotionally for years anyway. Now it would just be official. I left 3 days later with 2 suitcases, $300 I'd saved from babysitting jobs, and an acceptance letter to the local community college. My parents didn't help me carry my bags to the car. They didn't offer advice or well wishes. My father barely looked up from his newspaper when I said goodbye. Justin was the only one who seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. He stood in the doorway, fidgeting as I loaded my things into my beat-up Toyota. Good luck, I guess, he mumbled. I wanted to tell him so many things in that moment. I wanted to tell him that he'd been given every advantage while I'd been given none, and that one day he'd realize how much he'd squandered. But I just nodded and drove away. The apartment I could afford was a studio in a rough neighborhood, 400 square feet with a window that didn't quite close, and a bathroom where the shower only produced cold water half the time. It was perfect. It was mine. Community college classes were affordable, but living expenses weren't. Within a week, I'd found my first job waitressing at a 24-hour diner called Rosie's. The overnight shift paid slightly more, so I took those hours working from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, 3 nights a week. It wasn't enough. I added a second job as a cashier at a gas station covering afternoon shifts on the days I didn't have classes. When that still wasn't enough to cover tuition, rent, and food, I took a third position doing weekend housekeeping at a budget hotel. My life became a brutal cycle of classes. Work, sleep, repeat. I attended lectures on 4 hours of sleep, surviving on coffee, and the cheapest food I could find, ramen noodles, rice, whatever was on sale. I studied during my breaks at the diner, reading textbooks between refilling coffee cups for truckers and insomniacs. The exhaustion was crushing. There were mornings I'd finish my overnight shift and have to go straight to an 8 o'clock class, my body screaming for rest, my eyes burning from fatigue. There were nights I cried from sheer physical and mental depletion, wondering if I could actually sustain this pace. But something unexpected happened in that crucible of exhaustion and struggle. I became unbreakable. Every shift I completed, every exam I passed, despite being exhausted every month, I managed to pay my bills, prove to me that I was capable of surviving anything. The Pattersons had tried to convince me I was worthless, but I was proving them wrong one day at a time. I made myself a promise during those brutal first months on my own. I would never depend on anyone again. I would never put myself in a position where someone could control me through money or shelter or basic needs. I would build a life that was entirely my own, brick by brick if necessary. And for 2 years, that's exactly what I did. I finished my associate degree with a perfect 4.0 GPA. I networked with professors, attended every career seminar, volunteered for extra projects. When a finance professor mentioned that I had a natural talent for economic analysis, I started teaching myself more advanced concepts using library books and free online resources. Then, halfway through my second year, my academic advisor called me into her office with news that made my heart race with hope for the first time in years. "Chelsea, I've nominated you for the Sanderson Transfer Scholarship," Professor Martinez said, sliding a folder across her desk. "It's a full ride to a 4-year university tuition room, board books. Everything. Worth about $120,000 total." I stared at the application materials, afraid to touch them. Afraid this wasn't real. "You're my top candidate," she continued. "Your grades are perfect, your work ethic is exceptional, and your essay about overcoming adversity is the strongest I've read in 10 years of teaching. Chelsea, this is going to change your life." For the first time since leaving home, I let myself hope. Really hope. I imagined walking across a university campus, studying in a real dorm room, instead of my cramped studio, being able to focus on school without working 3 jobs. I imagined having a future that wasn't defined by exhaustion and survival. I completed the application with meticulous care, double and triple checking every document. I wrote and rewrote my personal statement until every word was perfect. Professor Martinez submitted everything on my behalf, assuring me I was virtually guaranteed to win. "Just a formality at this point," she said with a warm smile. "You should hear something in about 2 weeks." 2 weeks later, I received an email that made my blood run cold. "Dear Ms. Patterson, we regret to inform you that your application for the Sanderson Transfer Scholarship has been withdrawn due to incomplete documentation. As the withdrawal was submitted through your official email account, we have closed your file. The deadline for resubmission has passed." I read it 3 times, my hands shaking. Withdrawn? I hadn't withdrawn anything. I frantically called the scholarship office, spoke to 5 different people, tried to explain that there had been a mistake. "I'm sorry, Ms. Patterson," the administrator said, her voice sympathetic but firm. "Our records show a withdrawal request submitted from your email address 2 weeks ago. The sender knew your student ID number and personal details. We have to assume it was you." "But it wasn't me, I would never—" "I understand this is frustrating, but the deadline has passed. There's nothing we can do now. The scholarship has been awarded to another candidate." I hung up and sat in stunned silence in my tiny apartment. Someone had accessed my email. Someone had known about the scholarship. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the one opportunity I'd had to escape the exhausting grind of my life. But who and why? I spent one night crying. I let myself feel the full weight of the loss, the crushing disappointment, the rage at the unfairness of it all. I'd worked so hard. I'd done everything right, and someone had stolen it from me. Then I wiped my tears, got up, and went to my shift at the diner. Because that's what I did. I survived. I adapted. I moved forward. If I couldn't get the scholarship, I'd find another way. I took on extra shifts, sleeping even less. I enrolled in free online courses in financial analysis and investment strategy. I started applying for unpaid internships at finance firms, offering to work nights and weekends. Most firms ignored my applications. Some sent polite rejections. But one small investment company needed someone to help with data entry and basic analysis, and they were willing to let me work odd hours around my other jobs. I took it. I showed up early, stayed late, and absorbed everything I could about the industry. When they had questions about market trends or risk assessment, I volunteered answers. When they needed extra analysis done, I did it without being asked. Every rejection from other opportunities made me more determined. Every obstacle became fuel. I taught myself everything I could about finance investments, portfolio management. I studied the careers of successful analysts, looking for patterns for strategies I could replicate. The path was so much longer and harder than it should have been. While my former classmates who'd won scholarships were living in dorms and joining clubs, I was working 70-hour weeks just to survive while trying to build skills that might lead to a real career. But I refused to quit. Quitting would mean the Pattersons had been right about me. Quitting would mean whoever had sabotaged my scholarship had won. So I kept going one exhausting day at a time, building a future from nothing but determination and spite. Years later, I would discover exactly who stole my future and why. The unpaid internship turned into a paid position 6 months later. It wasn't much, barely above minimum wage, but it was a foot in the door at Morrison & Associates, a small investment firm in downtown Cleveland. I was 21 years old, still working nights at the diner to make rent, but finally doing work that felt like it mattered. I started as a junior analyst, which was a generous title for what was essentially data entry and coffee runs. But I treated every task like it was critical. When senior analysts needed market research compiled, I didn't just gather the data I organized, it analyzed it and highlighted patterns they might have missed. When someone needed help with a presentation, I stayed late to make sure every chart was perfect, every number verified. I arrived at the office an hour before anyone else and left an hour after everyone had gone home. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I was hungry to learn, hungry to prove myself, hungry to build something that no one could take away from me. My analyses were sharp. I had a knack for seeing risks that others overlooked, for identifying the small details that could derail a major deal. During my first year, I caught a discrepancy in a client's financial statements that would have cost the firm significant money if they'd proceeded with the recommended investment. My supervisor, a man named Richard, who'd been in the industry for 25 years, called me into his office. "How did you spot this?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I just kept asking, why?" I told him. "Why are their reported earnings inconsistent with their cash flow? Why does their debt structure look unusual for a company their size?" When the answers didn't make sense, I dug deeper. Richard studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Keep doing that." Within 3 years, I'd been promoted twice. I was no longer doing data entry and coffee runs. I was conducting full market analyses, presenting to clients, and building investment strategies for mid-sized companies. By the time I turned 25, I was leading restructuring projects, helping struggling businesses optimize their portfolios and manage their debt. My colleagues, many of them twice my age with impressive credentials, treated me with respect. They valued my work ethic and precision. They appreciated that I never cut corners and never presented analysis I wasn't confident about. I'd built a reputation as someone thorough, reliable, and insightful. The Pattersons had no idea. I never told them about my promotions, my successes, or the life I was building. We'd barely spoken since I'd left home 7 years earlier, occasional obligatory phone calls on holidays, brief and awkward. They never asked about my work, and I never volunteered the information. I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd proven to myself that I was capable, that I was valuable, that their assessment of my worth had been wrong. That was enough. Everything changed in early 2023 when Morrison & Associates was brought in to consult on a major corporate recovery project. The client was Whitmore Enterprises, a $200 million investment company facing serious restructuring challenges after a series of bad acquisitions had left them overextended and vulnerable. The CEO wanted outside analysis before making critical decisions about which assets to divest and how to stabilize their position. Our firm assembled a team of 5 analysts, and I was included not as the lead, but as a contributing member. David Whitmore attended our initial presentation. He was in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of experience. He listened intently as each team member presented their section of the analysis, asking sharp questions and taking notes. When my turn came, I presented my findings on risk mitigation and long-term growth strategy. I'd spent weeks analyzing their portfolio, identifying which divisions were bleeding resources and which had genuine potential. My recommendations weren't flashy or dramatic, they were practical, focused on sustainable recovery rather than quick fixes. I spoke about the companies Whitmore owned not as abstract assets, but as organizations with employees and communities that depended on them. I emphasized the importance of restructuring in a way that preserved as many jobs as possible while still achieving financial stability. When I finished, David leaned forward. "This is the first analysis I've heard that treats these companies like they're made of people instead of just numbers. Thank you for that perspective." After the presentation, he asked to speak with me privately. "I want you to lead the follow-up work on this project," he said. "Not your senior colleagues, you. Can you do that?" I'd been given opportunities before, but never something this significant. "Yes, sir. I can do that." Over the next 6 months, I worked more closely with David than I had with any client before. He wasn't just interested in the numbers, he wanted to understand the reasoning behind every recommendation, the implications of every decision. He challenged my analysis constantly, not to undermine me, but to make sure I'd thought through every angle. I realized quickly that David was brilliant. He had an intuitive understanding of markets and human behavior that went beyond anything I'd learned in textbooks. But he was also humble, willing to admit when he didn't know something, and genuinely interested in hearing perspectives different from his own. He observed me carefully during those months. I'd catch him watching me during meetings with an expression I couldn't quite read, not suspicion exactly, but something close to recognition, as if he were trying to remember where he'd seen me before. The way I tilted my head when I was thinking through a problem, the precise hand gestures I used when explaining complex data, the way I spoke about struggling companies with genuine compassion, talking about second chances and redemption, as if businesses were people who deserved grace. "You remind me of someone," he said once, almost to himself. "Someone I knew a long time ago." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just smiled politely and redirected the conversation back to the project. But one day during a meeting, something shifted. I was presenting quarterly projections using my hands to illustrate the trajectory of different scenarios. David's attention wasn't on the charts I'd prepared. He was staring at my right hand, specifically at the simple silver ring I wore on my ring finger. His face went completely still. The color drained from his cheeks. "Where did you get that ring?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I looked down at the ring, the one piece of jewelry I owned that wasn't from a discount store. It had been among the few personal effects my mother had left when she died, according to the social worker who'd helped place me with the Pattersons. I'd found it years later tucked in a box in the back of their closet and claimed it as mine without asking permission. "It was my mother's," I said simply. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your mother's name. What was your mother's name?" The intensity of his reaction startled me. I don't know. I was very young when she died. The Pattersons never talked about her." "The Pattersons," David repeated. "They're not your biological parents." "No," I said slowly, confused by the direction of this conversation. "They adopted me when I was 5. Why?" David sat back down heavily, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his phone. He pulled up a photo and turned the screen toward me. "Is this your ring?" The image showed a silver ring identical to mine, same delicate engravings, same unique design. "Yes," I whispered. "Where did you see that?" "I designed it," David said, his voice thick with emotion. 23 years ago, there were only 2 made. One I gave to my business partner. One I gave to my mother before she died. He looked at me with an expression of dawning realization and something that looked almost like grief. "Which means you're wearing Sarah Chen's ring." which means you're her daughter. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. I don't understand. Who is Sarah Chen? Was, David corrected quietly. She was my business partner. She was brilliant, compassionate, and one of the best people I ever knew. She died of cancer in 2003. He paused, studying my face. She had a 5-year-old daughter named Chelsea. My heart stopped. That's impossible. Is it? David asked. Or is it the first true thing anyone's ever told you about where you came from? I didn't know that ring would soon reveal everything and change both our lives forever. David insisted we continue this conversation somewhere private. We left the office and drove to a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where business people had confidential discussions in corner booths. I was shaking the entire drive, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to articulate. Once we were seated in a secluded booth, David ordered coffee for both of us, though neither of us touched it. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, choosing his words carefully. Your mother's name was Sarah Chen, he began. She wasn't just someone I knew casually. She was my business partner and co-founder of Whitmore Enterprises. We started the company together in 1995. I tried to process this information, but it felt like he was talking about a stranger, not the shadowy figure who'd existed only as an absence in my life. Sarah was extraordinary. David continued, his voice warm with memory. She had this incredible ability to see patterns in market data that everyone else missed. She could predict trends months before they materialized. In our second year of business, we were on the verge of bankruptcy. Everyone told us to fold, cut our losses. But Sarah identified an emerging market in tech infrastructure that she was convinced would explode. She was right. Her analysis saved the company and set us on the path to everything we built. What was she like? The question came out as barely a whisper. As a person, I mean. David smiled, though his eyes were sad. Brilliant, obviously, but also kind. She cared deeply about the human impact of our work. She'd refuse to invest in companies with poor labor practices, even if they were profitable. She believed business should serve people, not just shareholders. He paused. You remind me of her in that way. The way you talked about preserving jobs during the restructuring. That was pure Sarah. My throat tightened. Why did she die? What happened? Cancer, David said quietly. Breast cancer. She was diagnosed in 2001, fought it for 2 years. I watched her work through chemotherapy, never complaining, still making brilliant decisions even when she was exhausted and sick. She died in March 2003. You would have been 5 years old. I did the math quickly. That aligned with my earliest concrete memories, being taken to the Patterson house feeling confused and scared, not understanding why my mother wasn't there anymore. She talked about you constantly, David continued. How smart you were, how curious. She showed me drawings you'd made, told me about the questions you'd ask. She was so proud of you. His voice cracked slightly. When she knew the cancer was terminal, she made arrangements. She told me a family had agreed to adopt you to give you stability. She said their name was Patterson. I offered to help financially to check on you, but she said they wanted privacy to bond as a family. I respected that. I thought you were being cared for, loved. If I'd known... He stopped, composing himself. You couldn't have known, I said, though part of me wished he had. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn leather folder, the edges soft with age. I've kept this in my office safe for 20 years. I always hoped I'd find you one day and be able to give it to you. He opened the folder carefully, revealing documents protected in clear sleeves. The first was a partnership agreement dated 1995, signed by Sarah Chen and David Whitmore. The second was a will, Sarah's signature at the bottom. When Sarah died, our partnership agreement specified that if one partner passed away, the other had the option to buy out their stake at fair market value, David explained. Her 30% ownership in the company was valued at $2.5 million in 2003. I bought her stake as agreed, but I didn't keep the money. He pulled out another document, a trust agreement. I established an irrevocable trust fund in your name. The entire $2.5 million went into it with instructions that it be released to you when you turned 25, provided you could verify your identity through DNA confirmation and present proper documentation. My hands trembled as I took the papers. 25. But I'm 26 now. I know, David said grimly. You should have received this last year. The trust was set up to contact you automatically through the legal firm managing it when you turned 25. But there was a problem. He pulled out more papers, these ones more recent, covered in legal jargon and financial figures. The trust had grown significantly over 21 years through compound interest and careful investment. As of 2024, it's worth $7.8 million. I couldn't breathe. $7.8 million. Money that was supposed to be mine. Money that could have changed everything, paid for university, given me security, let me sleep more than 4 hours a night during those brutal years of working 3 jobs. Why didn't I know about this? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Because in 2022, when the trust administrator tried to contact you through the information we had on file, they reached the Patterson family, David said. Your father told them you'd moved away, that you'd cut off contact with the family, and they had no way to reach you. He said you'd had some kind of mental breakdown and were unstable. He suggested the trust send the money to them for safekeeping until you recovered. Rage, white hot and pure, flooded through me. They lied. Yes, David said simply. The trust administrator refused to transfer the funds to anyone but you directly, which is when the Pattersons stopped cooperating entirely. They cut off all communication. That's when I knew something was wrong. What did you do? I hired a private investigator, David said. In late 2022, I needed to find you to make sure you were okay. The investigator found you within 2 weeks. You were alive, working in finance, had never disappeared or had any mental breakdown. You'd simply left home and built a life for yourself. He paused, his expression darkening. But the investigator also found other things. Financial records showing the Pattersons had received substantial government assistance for your care that they'd never used on you. Inconsistencies in your adoption paperwork. A pattern of concerning behavior. You've been investigating them for over a year, I asked, stunned. Yes, and when your name came across my desk in early 2023 as part of the analyst team for our restructuring project, I thought I was seeing things. The coincidence seemed impossible. But then I saw you in person, and I knew immediately. You look so much like Sarah. Same eyes, same way of moving through the world. Why didn't you tell me right away? Part of me felt betrayed that he'd known for months. Because I needed to be absolutely certain, David said. I needed DNA confirmation, which I obtained from a coffee cup you used in my office 6 weeks ago. I needed to verify every piece of documentation. And honestly, I needed to understand what had happened to you, why the Pattersons had lied what they'd done. His voice hardened. I needed evidence before I acted because I knew once I revealed the truth there would be consequences. I wanted to make sure those consequences were thorough and permanent. What kind of evidence did you find? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. David's expression turned grim. More than enough to destroy them, but I think it's better if we address that together in person. There's something I need you to do first. What? I need you to go home for Christmas, he said. Your mother called my office last week. She doesn't know you work for me. She invited me to a holiday dinner at their house, clearly hoping to impress me into giving Justin a job. He paused. She also mentioned in passing that the housekeeper would be there to help serve. I assume that's you. The humiliation of it burned. They want me to serve food while they try to use you. Yes, David said. Which is why I accepted the invitation. Because I'm going to walk into that house and I'm going to let them perform their little charade. I'm going to let them introduce you as the housekeeper while they try to manipulate me. And then I'm going to tell them exactly who you are, what they've done, and what's going to happen to them next. His eyes met mine, and I saw cold fury there. They stole your mother's legacy. They stole your inheritance. They stole years of your life, and I have every piece of evidence we need to make sure they pay for it." But the truth he'd uncovered was far worse than either of us imagined, and it was about to explode. I couldn't stop staring at the ring on my finger. Something I'd worn for years without thinking much about it had suddenly become the most significant object in my life. David noticed my fixation. "The engravings aren't random," he said gently. "Look closely at the inner band." I slipped the ring off and held it up to the light. Inside, almost too small to read, were tiny engraved words: SC, Strength and Truth, 1998. "Sarah Chen," David said. "I had them made when our company turned its first real profit in 1998. It was her idea, actually. She said we needed something to remind us of our principles when things got difficult. Strength and truth, that was her philosophy. She believed that honest analysis, honest business practices, honest relationships were the only foundation worth building on." "What happened to the other ring?" I asked. "The one you made for your mother?" "She was buried with it," David said quietly. "She died in 1999. Sarah was at the funeral. She told me then that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted me to make sure you got her ring, that you'd understand its meaning when you were old enough." He paused. "The Pattersons must have found it among her things and kept it. I'm glad they did, even if their motives were wrong. It led me back to you." The weight of the ring felt different now as I slid it back onto my finger. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a connection to a mother I barely remembered, a legacy I'd been denied, and proof of an identity that had been hidden from me for 21 years. I was still processing everything. The trust fund, the investigation, the staggering amount of money that should have been mine when my phone rang 2 days later. The name on the screen made my stomach clench. Mom. We'd barely spoken in the 7 years since I'd left home. The occasional awkward phone call on my birthday or major holidays conversations that lasted 5 minutes at most. She'd never asked about my life, my work, whether I was happy or struggling. And I'd stopped expecting her to care. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Chelsea, sweetheart." Her voice was sickeningly sweet, a tone I'd never heard her use with me before. "How have you been? It's been far too long." "Hello, Mrs. Patterson," I said coolly. I'd stopped calling her Mom years ago, though she'd never seemed to notice or care. "Oh, don't be formal, dear. Listen, I'm calling because Christmas is coming up and you know what they say, families should be together for the holidays. We'd love to have you over for dinner. Christmas Eve. What do you say?" Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. "Why now? We haven't celebrated Christmas together in years." "Well, that's exactly why," she said, her forced cheerfulness grating. "We've let too much time pass. Your father and I were just saying how much we miss you, and Justin would love to see you." That was a lie. Justin had made no effort to contact me since I'd left. "I don't know," I said slowly. "I might have other plans." "Oh, please try to make it work, dear. It would mean so much to us." She paused, then added in a carefully casual tone, "We're having a special guest, actually. A very important CEO. Your father has some business he'd like to discuss. It would be nice to have the whole family there." There it was. The real reason for the invitation. "What CEO?" I asked, though I already knew. "David Whitmore," she said, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. "From Whitmore Enterprises. Your father met him at a conference. Such an impressive man. We're hoping he might have an opportunity for Justin. You know how hard it's been for your brother to find the right position." Justin had been unemployed or underemployed for 3 years, coasting on his parents' support, waiting for someone to hand him success he hadn't earned. The irony that they were now trying to use a dinner party to manipulate the very man I'd been working with for 6 months would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. "I see," I said neutrally. "And what would you want me to do at this dinner?" "Oh, just help out a bit, dear. You know, with the serving and cleaning up. We want to make a good impression, and you were always so good at that sort of thing. So good at being the servant. So good at being invisible. Even now, after 7 years of independence, they still saw me as nothing more than free labor. I'll think about it, I said. Please do come, Mrs. Patterson pressed. It really would mean a lot. Family is so important. I ended the call and immediately texted David. They invited me, want me to serve food while they impress you. His response came within seconds. Don't go, they're users. They'll hurt you again. But something was crystallizing in my mind. A plan. A reckoning. I called David instead of texting back. I want to go, I said when he answered. Chelsea, I don't think that's wise. You don't need to subject yourself to their toxicity. I want to see their faces, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I want to watch them perform their charade, try to use you, treat me like I'm nothing. And then I want to see their expressions when you tell them the truth. When everything they've built on lies comes crashing down. There was a long pause. You're sure? I've spent 21 years being invisible in that house, wondering why I wasn't good enough to be loved. I want answers. I want to know why they did this. And I want them to face what they've done with their lies exposed in front of witnesses. All right, David said finally. Then we'll do it your way. I'll follow your lead. But Chelsea, when you're ready, when you give me the signal, I'm going to tell them everything. And I won't hold back. Good, I said. I don't want you to hold back. I want them to know exactly what they stole from me. I want them to understand the consequences of their choices. When you're ready, he said quietly, I'll help you burn their house of lies to the ground. I hung up and sat in my apartment looking at the ring on my finger. Strength, in truth. That's what my mother had believed in. That's what I'd been denied my entire life. But not anymore. I texted Mrs. Patterson back. I'll be there. What time? Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. 6 p.m. Oh, wonderful, and Chelsea. Dear, maybe wear something plain. We want the focus to be on our guest. Of course they did. I had no idea that Christmas dinner would become the night that destroyed them and freed me. I arrived at the Patterson house 2 days before Christmas as requested. The moment I walked through the door, I was transported back to my childhood, not by nostalgia, but by the familiar feeling of being unwelcome in a place that should have been home. The house was in chaos. Mrs. Patterson was on the phone arguing with a catering company about delivery times, while simultaneously hanging expensive decorations that still had price tags attached. Mr. Patterson sat at the dining room table with a stack of business magazines, reading aloud and practicing responses to questions he imagined David might ask. So, Mr. Whitmore, I've been following your company's trajectory, and I believe there's significant synergy between your vision and the skill set my son brings to the table. He rehearsed his voice, taking on an artificial smoothness that made him sound like a used car salesman. Justin stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. How's this too formal, not formal enough? He asked no one in particular. Mrs. Patterson glanced at me briefly. Oh, good you're here. Kitchen, now. There's a lot to do. No hello, no acknowledgement that we hadn't seen each other in months. Just orders. I followed her into the kitchen where she'd laid out an overwhelming amount of food preparation. I need you to handle all of this, she said, gesturing at cutting boards, vegetables, and partially prepared dishes. The caterers are bringing the main courses, but we need appetizers, sides, and everything has to look homemade. Mr. Whitmore needs to think we're sophisticated but humble. Understood, I said quietly. And Chelsea, she added, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, stay out of sight until the guest leaves. We can't have him seeing you like this. Her eyes swept over my jeans and simple sweater with obvious distaste. Like this. As if I were something shameful. As if my existence was an embarrassment. We'll tell him you're our housekeeper, she continued. It's easier that way. You don't mind, do you? It's just for one evening. I minded. I minded so much I could feel rage burning in my chest. But I just nodded. Whatever you need, Over the next 2 days, I watched the Patterson family transform into caricatures of themselves. Mr. Patterson spent hours on YouTube watching videos titled How to Impress Wealthy Executives and Networking Tips for the Elite. He practiced his handshake in the mirror, timing it to be exactly 3 seconds, not too brief, not too long. He rehearsed anecdotes that made him sound more successful than he was, carefully omitting the consultancies he'd lost and the contracts that had dried up. Mrs. Patterson hired a catering service they absolutely could not afford, putting it on a credit card that was already maxed out. She bought a new dress, new tablecloths, even new Christmas decorations because the old ones looked cheap. Everything was about appearances, about creating an illusion of success and stability that didn't exist. Justin was perhaps the most pathetic. He'd been unemployed for 8 months, living at home, contributing nothing. But for this dinner, he was being packaged as an ambitious young professional with tremendous potential. His parents drilled him on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. "Don't mention that you left your last 3 jobs," Mr. Patterson instructed. "If he asks about your employment history, say you've been strategically positioning yourself for the right opportunity." "Don't talk about video games," Mrs. Patterson added. "Don't mention that you're living at home, and for God's sake, don't eat too much. You need to look disciplined." They were so focused on their performance, so consumed with desperation, that they didn't notice me observing everything with cold, analytical detachment. I wasn't the scared little girl who'd grown up in this house anymore. I was the woman who'd survived their cruelty, built a career they knew nothing about, and was now holding all the cards while they played a game they'd already lost. I prepped food while they rehearsed. I polished silverware while Mr. Patterson practiced his casual laugh, the one that was supposed to signal confidence and ease, but sounded forced and brittle. I set the table while Mrs. Patterson coached Justin on proper handshake technique. The desperation was palpable. They saw David Whitmore as their salvation, their lottery ticket out of the financial hole they'd dug through years of poor decisions and living beyond their means. They needed this connection. They needed Justin to get a job at a prestigious company so they could stop supporting him. They needed to appear successful to maintain their standing in their social circle. Everything hinged on this one dinner, on fooling one man for one evening. They had no idea that man already knew everything. Christmas Eve arrived with the house looking like a magazine spread and the family looking like they might shatter from tension. Mr. Patterson had changed his shirt 3 times. Mrs. Patterson kept checking her makeup, reapplying lipstick, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. Justin paced the living room, muttering his rehearsed talking points under his breath. I stayed in the kitchen wearing the plain black dress and apron Mrs. Patterson had laid out for me, the uniform of a servant, the role they'd assigned me since childhood, now made literal. "Remember," Mrs. Patterson hissed at me 15 minutes before David was scheduled to arrive, "you're the housekeeper. You work for us. You're grateful we gave you a job. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not insert yourself into conversations. Just serve the food, clean up, and stay invisible." "I understand," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Mr. Patterson was practicing his greeting one last time when the doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. David was punctual. I'd learned that about him during our months working together. The transformation that came over the Patterson family was instantaneous. The anxiety melted into practiced smiles. The tension disappeared behind masks of warmth and charm. Mr. Patterson straightened his shoulders. Mrs. Patterson's smile became radiant. Justin adopted a posture of confident professionalism. They were ready for their performance. I pulled out my phone and sent David a quick text where they couldn't see "ready." His response came immediately. "Let's do this." I slipped my phone back into my pocket and picked up a tray of appetizers, positioning myself in the kitchen doorway where I could watch everything unfold. Mr. Patterson opened the front door with his rehearsed smile and perfect handshake timing. "Mr. Whitmore, what an absolute honor to have you in our home. Please come in, come in." David stepped inside wearing an expensive suit and an expression of polite professionalism. His eyes swept the room, taking in the over-the-top decorations, the nervous energy, the transparent desperation beneath the veneer of hospitality. Then his gaze found me standing in the kitchen doorway, and for just a fraction of a second, something shifted in his expression. A barely perceptible acknowledgement. A signal that he saw me, that he understood that he was ready. The game had begun. And then, right on schedule, the CEO walked through the door, and their entire world began to crumble. David's eyes found mine the moment he stepped through the doorway. I stood in the kitchen entrance wearing the plain black dress and apron Mrs. Patterson had selected for me, my hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, holding a tray of appetizers, like the good servant they wanted me to be. Our eyes locked for maybe half a second. I gave the slightest shake of my head so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. "Don't acknowledge me yet. Let them show you who they really are first." I saw his jaw tighten, saw the flash of anger in his eyes at seeing me relegated to this role. But he was a professional who'd spent decades in high-stakes business negotiations. He knew how to control his reactions. He gave me the tiniest nod of understanding and turned to face the Pattersons with a polite, pleasant smile that revealed absolutely nothing. The game was on, and we both knew our parts. Mr. Patterson surged forward with the aggressive enthusiasm of a man who'd watched too many networking seminars. "Mr. Whitmore, what an incredible honor to have you in our home." His handshake was exactly 3 seconds long, just as he'd practiced, but the grip was too firm, trying too hard to convey confidence and competence. David accepted the handshake with professional grace. "Thank you for the invitation. You have a lovely home." "Oh, it's nothing compared to what you must be accustomed to," Mrs. Patterson gushed, practically bouncing on her heels. She reached out and actually touched David's arm, her fingers lingering on his sleeve. "That suit is exquisite. Armani. You have such refined taste. And your car. We saw you pull up. Absolutely stunning." I watched David's expression remain perfectly neutral, though I knew him well enough now to see the slight tension around his eyes. He was being sized up like a prize to be won, and he knew it. Justin stepped forward with the mechanical stiffness of someone executing rehearsed movements. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, Justin Patterson. It's a privilege to meet you." His handshake was precisely timed, his posture carefully arranged to project confidence. "I've been following Whitmore Enterprises' trajectory for years. Your approach to sustainable growth in volatile markets is fascinating." He'd memorized that line. I'd heard him practice it a dozen times over the past 2 days. "Thank you," David said simply, not taking the bait to elaborate. Please come sit," Mr. Patterson said, steering David toward the living room where they'd arranged the seating to position him in the place of honor, the leather armchair that faced the rest of the room. "Can I offer you a drink? I have a Macallan 18 that I've been saving for a special occasion." The Macallan had been purchased yesterday specifically for this dinner, another expense they couldn't afford, charged to an already maxed credit card. I knew because I'd heard Mrs. Patterson arguing with the liquor store about their delivery fee. David accepted a glass, settling into the armchair with the ease of someone comfortable in any environment. Mr. Patterson and Justin positioned themselves on the sofa across from him, while Mrs. Patterson fluttered around offering appetizers and making sure David's glass stayed full. "So I have to tell you," Mr. Patterson began, launching into what was clearly a prepared speech, "when I heard you'd be in the area for the holidays, I thought to myself, here's a man who truly understands the future of strategic investment. Your work in the tech infrastructure sector has been revolutionary." He hadn't heard David would be in the area. Mrs. Patterson had contacted David's office directly and practically begged for this meeting. But revision was easier than honesty. David responded with non-committal pleasantries, professional but distant. I could see him observing everything, the too expensive decorations that still had creases from being packed, the forced casualness of the scene, the desperate energy beneath the smiles. Mrs. Patterson kept up a running commentary punctuated by high-pitched laughs that sounded like breaking glass. "Your success story is just so inspiring. Building a company from nothing, though I'm sure you had advantages. Education connections. Not like some people who just expect handouts. She shot a pointed glance toward the kitchen toward me, though she didn't think David would notice or understand the reference. Justin worked his rehearsed talking points into the conversation with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "I've actually been looking at Harvard Business School applications," he said, despite having barely passed community college courses. "I believe in positioning myself strategically for maximum opportunity impact." He'd practiced that phrase so many times it had lost all meaning, becoming just sounds strung together to create an impression of competence. From my position near the kitchen, I observed everything with the detachment of a researcher studying specimens. I watched my father laugh too loudly at things David said that weren't jokes, the sound booming and false. I watched my mother lean in too close when she refreshed his drink, invading his personal space in a way that made even me uncomfortable from across the room. I watched Justin try to mirror David's body language while simultaneously name-dropping schools he'd never attended and positions he'd never held. They were performing a play badly, and I was the stagehand they'd forgotten existed. The invisible servant who heard everything, saw everything, and mattered not at all in their calculations. But I wouldn't be invisible much longer. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the room must hear it, but my hands were steady as I circulated with trays of appetizers. I'd spent 25 years being invisible in this house, being dismissed and diminished and treated like I didn't matter. I'd spent my entire childhood wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't earn their love. Tonight, all of that ended. Tonight, I would finally be seen, and they would finally understand what they'd thrown away. Other guests began to arrive, neighbors, business associates of my father's people, invited to pad the numbers and make the evening look like a legitimate social gathering rather than the obvious networking ambush it actually was. The living room filled with polite conversation and the clink of glasses. One of the neighbors, a woman named Carol, who'd lived down the street for years, noticed me carrying a tray. "Oh, who's this?" she asked Mrs. Patterson. This was the moment. I held my breath, waiting for whatever lie they'd prepared. Mrs. Patterson didn't even glance at me. Her voice was casual, dismissive, as if she were identifying a piece of furniture rather than a person. And then my father pointed directly at me and said the words that would seal his fate. My father's finger pointed across the room at me with casual indifference, as if he were indicating where they kept the cleaning supplies. "Oh, that's Chelsea," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the gathering. "She's just our housekeeper." The room didn't gasp. There was no dramatic reaction. People simply nodded, accepted the information, and moved on with their conversations. To them, I was exactly what he'd labeled me: hired help, someone beneath notice, part of the background scenery of a holiday gathering. Just our housekeeper. 3 words that erased 25 years of my life, all my accomplishments, everything I'd overcome. 3 words that reduced me to a function rather than a person. Mrs. Patterson laughed, the sound high and brittle. "We let her stay here out of pity, really?" she added, as if she were being generous, as if she were doing me some tremendous favor. "She had nowhere else to go, but honestly, she's quite good with a mop." More laughter rippled through the room, polite, superficial chuckles from people who didn't know me and didn't care to. I was a punchline, a prop in their performance of charitable benevolence. I stood there frozen, holding a tray of half-empty glasses, and felt that old familiar shame wash over me like ice water. It didn't matter that I had a career they knew nothing about. It didn't matter that I'd built a life from nothing while they'd squandered every advantage. It didn't matter that the CEO they were desperately trying to impress was my colleague and knew exactly what I was worth. In that moment, I was 13 again, being told I was lucky they kept me. I was 16 again, being dismissed as too stupid for education. I was every age I'd ever been in this house, being made to feel small and worthless and grateful for scraps. My hands trembled slightly as I moved through the room collecting discarded plates and napkins. I kept my head down, playing the role they'd assigned, waiting for the right moment. David had been making polite conversation with one of my father's colleagues, but I could feel his attention shifting. When I glanced up briefly, I saw his eyes sweeping the room with barely concealed anger, his jaw tight, his whole body radiating controlled fury. Then his gaze landed on my hands. I was reaching across a side table to pick up an empty wine glass when I noticed him staring, not at my face, but at my right hand. Specifically at the silver ring I wore, the one that had belonged to my mother, the one I'd worn every day for years without fully understanding its significance. David went completely still. The color drained from his face. His eyes locked onto that ring with an intensity that made me stop moving, frozen mid-reach. I saw the recognition flash across his features, saw the moment he connected what he was seeing with what he knew. This was the ring he'd designed, the ring he'd given to Sarah Chen, the ring that shouldn't exist on anyone's hand except in a grave or in my possession. And here I was, wearing irrefutable proof of my identity, being treated like hired help in the home that was supposed to have given me family. Something shifted in David's expression. The polite professional mask he'd been wearing for the past 30 minutes cracked and fell away, replaced by something cold and hard and absolutely merciless. He set down his whiskey glass with deliberate precision. The quiet click of crystal against wood shouldn't have been loud enough to interrupt a room full of conversation, but somehow it was. People stopped talking mid-sentence. The temperature in this room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David stood slowly, his movements controlled but charged with purpose. Every eye in the room turned to him. He commanded attention without saying a word, just by the shift in his bearing from polite guest to something far more dangerous. Mr. Patterson noticed the change immediately. His practiced smile faltered. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitmore?" His voice had a nervous edge. David didn't respond to him, didn't even look at him. Instead, he walked directly toward me, his footsteps loud in the sudden silence, each one deliberate and final. I stood paralyzed, still holding the tray of glasses as this powerful man crossed the room with singular focus. Every guest watched in confused silence, sensing something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale. She'd positioned herself near the kitchen, and I saw her hand grip the back of a chair for support. Some instinct was telling her this wasn't going according to plan, that control was slipping from their grasp. Justin looked between David and me with growing confusion, his rehearsed talking points forgotten. David stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. Up close, I could see the fury there, barely restrained. But when he spoke, his voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. "Where did you get that ring?" The question cut through the silence like a knife. Simple words, but loaded with meaning that only the two of us fully understood. My throat was tight. I was aware of every person in the room watching us, waiting for my answer. "It was my mother's," I said quietly. "Your mother's?" David repeated, his eyes never leaving mine. Then he looked up, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Mr. and Mrs. Patterson. "This young woman's mother. The woman who died when she was 5 years old. Do you know who her mother was?" Mr. Patterson tried to laugh it off. "I don't see what that has to do with anything. Chelsea is just here to help with her name." David interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Do you even know her mother's name?" The Pattersons exchanged nervous glances. Mrs. Patterson opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "That was a long time ago. We don't really discuss Sarah Chen," David said, his voice ringing clear and hard through the room. "Her mother's name was Sarah Chen, and this ring," he gestured to my hand, "was designed by me personally in 1998. There were only 2 made in the entire world. I gave one to Sarah Chen when our company turned its first profit. I gave the other to my mother before she died." The room had gone absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. And then David asked the question that would shatter their world. "Where did you get that ring?" "From my mother," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the silent room. David turned slowly to face the Pattersons, and the expression on his face was nothing like the polite professionalism he'd worn all evening. This was cold, calculated fury. "That ring," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "belonged to Sarah Chen, my business partner. One of the most brilliant financial minds I've ever had the privilege of knowing. I designed it myself 23 years ago and had it custom made by a jeweler in New York. There are only two in existence, the one Sarah wore and the one I gave to my mother before she was buried. He paused, letting that information settle over the stunned guests. Sarah Chen was Chelsea's mother. David continued, each word deliberate and weighted. Which makes this young woman you just called the housekeeper, this woman you claim to keep out of pity, the daughter of the woman who helped me build a $200 million company from nothing. Mr. Patterson's face had gone from healthy ruddiness to an alarming shade of red. Now wait just a minute. I'm not finished, David said, his tone brooking no interruption. Chelsea isn't your housekeeper. She's one of the top strategic analysts in the country. She's my colleague. In fact, she's the person who saved my company from a $30 million loss last year when she identified risks that my entire senior team had missed. I saw Mrs. Patterson grip the back of the chair harder, her knuckles white. David pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness. Since you seem so unfamiliar with your own daughter's accomplishments, let me enlighten you. He tapped his screen a few times, then aimed it at the large television mounted on the wall. The smart TV connected to his phone, and suddenly the screen was filled with an article from Fortune magazine. The headline read, "Unsung Heroes, the Analysts Behind Corporate Turnarounds." And there, halfway down the page, was my professional headshot and a full profile. Chelsea Patterson, 26. David read aloud, has quietly become one of the most sought-after restructuring analysts in the Midwest. Her innovative approach to risk mitigation and sustainable growth strategies has helped save over a dozen companies from bankruptcy. Industry insiders credit her meticulous attention to detail and her unusual ability to balance financial necessity with human impact. The guests were staring at the screen, then at me, then at the Pattersons, trying to reconcile what they were hearing with what they'd been told. David's voice grew harder. This woman who you introduced as someone you keep out of pity, someone who's good with a mop, has a professional reputation that would put most people in this room to shame. She's respected by executives across multiple industries. She's been recruited by firms in New York and San Francisco, though she's chosen to stay here. I hadn't known that last part. I'd gotten offers but assumed they were routine recruitment emails. It hadn't occurred to me that they were serious. Chelsea Patterson isn't your housekeeper, David said, his eyes sweeping the room and landing on each guest before finally settling on the Pattersons with withering contempt. She's my colleague, a woman I respect immensely, and someone I'm honored to know. She came here tonight because she's more gracious than any of you will ever comprehend. But make no mistake, she owes you nothing. Not her time, not her labor, and certainly not her gratitude. Justin's mouth was hanging open. I watched my brother process this information, saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. His entire identity had been built on being better than me, smarter, more valuable, more deserving of investment and opportunity. That foundation was crumbling in real time. Mr. Patterson tried to recover, forcing a laugh that came out strangled and false. Well, of course we're proud of her. We were just joking around. Family humor, you understand. We've always known Chelsea was capable. Have you? David's question cut through the excuse like a blade. Because from where I'm standing, you've done everything possible to ensure she never reached her potential. You told my trust administrator in 2022 that she'd had a mental breakdown and disappeared. You told scholarship committees she had behavioral problems. You've spent years actively sabotaging her future. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Guests were whispering to each other, looking at the Pattersons with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone from pale to blotchy red. We didn't know she worked for you, she stammered, as if that explained or excused anything. David's response was withering. You didn't bother to know anything about her at all. In 7 years, did you ever once ask what she was doing with her life? Did you ever inquire about her career, her struggles, her successes? Or was she only valuable to you as free labor when you needed someone to serve appetizers at your desperate networking dinner? The silence that followed was suffocating. Carol, the neighbor who'd asked about me earlier, was staring at Mrs. Patterson with undisguised horror. "Margaret, is this true? You've been telling everyone Chelsea was troubled, that she'd cut you off. You made it sound like she was the problem." Mrs. Patterson opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Justin finally found his voice, though it was thin and defensive. "This is ridiculous. Chelsea, tell them this is some kind of misunderstanding. You're making us look bad." "Making you look bad." The words burst out of me before I could stop them. "You introduced me as your housekeeper. You've spent the evening laughing about how I'm good with a mop. You did this to yourselves. We gave you a home." Mr. Patterson's voice rose defensive and angry. "We took you in when no one else would. We raised you. You used me." I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. "You took government money meant for my care and spent it on yourselves. You sabotaged my education. You made me believe I was worthless. And you did it all while pretending to be generous." The guests were backing away now, sensing this was far more than a simple family disagreement. This was the exposure of something dark and long hidden. David stepped closer to me, a gesture of solidarity and protection. "These people have lied to you, stolen from you, and undermined you at every opportunity, and we're just getting started on exposing exactly what they've done." He turned back to the Pattersons, and his expression was absolute zero. "Because here's what you don't know yet. Here's the part that's going to destroy what's left of your dignity and your financial future." Mr. Patterson's face had gone from red to gray. "What are you talking about?" David's smile was cold and terrifying. "About the $8 million you've been hiding from Chelsea for 21 years. But that wasn't the worst revelation, because David hadn't told them about the money yet. $8 million. The number hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. The guests didn't need to be asked twice to leave. They gathered coats and purses in awkward silence, throwing pitying and disgusted looks at the Pattersons as they filed out. Carol paused at the door, looking at me with something like regret. "I'm sorry, Chelsea. We should have known something was wrong." Then she was gone, and we were alone. Just me, the Pattersons, and David. The silence was suffocating. David walked calmly to the dining room table and set down his briefcase. He opened it with deliberate precision, pulling out a thick manila folder. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a request. Mr. Patterson tried to salvage some authority. "Now see here, you can't just come into our home and sit down." David's voice didn't rise, but the command in it was absolute. They sat. Even Justin, who looked like he wanted to run, sank onto the couch. I remained standing near the kitchen, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and emotions I couldn't name. David pulled documents from the folder and spread them across the coffee table with the precision of a prosecutor laying out evidence. When Sarah Chen died in March 2003, she owned 30% of Whitmore Enterprises. Our partnership agreement, signed in 1995, specified that if either partner died, the surviving partner had first right to purchase the deceased partner's stake at fair market value. He slid a document across the table. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed, but the signatures at the bottom were clear: Sarah Chen and David Whitmore. In 2003, her 30% was valued at $2.5 million. David continued. "I purchased her stake as agreed, but I didn't keep that money." He pulled out another set of documents: trust agreements, legal contracts with official seals and notarizations. "I established an irrevocable trust fund in the name of Chelsea Patterson, Sarah Chen's daughter. The entire $2.5 million was placed in that trust with specific instructions for its management and release." My legs felt weak. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. "The trust was structured with 2 conditions for release," David said, his eyes fixed on the Pattersons. "First, the beneficiary had to reach age 25. Second, she had to provide DNA verification proving she was Sarah Chen's biological daughter. I serve as trustee administrator, but I have no access to the funds. Only Chelsea, upon meeting those conditions, could claim her inheritance. He slid a financial statement across the table. The numbers were staggering. That $2.5 million invested conservatively over 21 years, with compound interest, is now worth $7.8 million. I couldn't breathe. $7.8 million. While I'd been working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating ramen because it was all I could afford, there had been nearly $8 million with my name on it. Chelsea turned 25 in 2023. David continued, his voice hardening. The trust administrator attempted to contact her through the information on file, which led to you. Do you want to tell Chelsea what you told them, or should I? Mrs. Patterson was crying silently, mascara running down her face. Mr. Patterson's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. You told them she'd disappeared, David said when neither of them spoke. You claimed she'd had a mental breakdown, that she'd cut off all contact with the family and you had no way to reach her. You suggested they send the money to you for safekeeping until she recovered. That's not, we didn't, Mr. Patterson started. Don't lie to me, David cut him off. I have recordings of the phone calls, I have emails, I have everything. He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. The trust administrator refused to release funds to anyone but you. That's when the Pattersons stopped cooperating entirely. They cut off all communication and refused to provide any information about your whereabouts. That's when I knew something was very wrong and started investigating. You couldn't steal it directly, I said slowly, the pieces falling into place. The trust was protected, but you could make sure I never found out about it. Exactly, David confirmed. If you'd gone to a good university, you might have consulted with financial aid advisors, lawyers, career counselors, any number of people who might have helped you discover this trust. You needed to stay poor, desperate, and ignorant. That's why they sabotaged your scholarship. That's why they isolated you and told you that you were worthless. They needed you to believe you had nothing and were nothing. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Every obstacle, every setback, every moment of crushing disappointment, it had all been orchestrated to keep me from discovering what was rightfully mine. Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head. We were trying to protect you. You were too young to handle that kind of money. You thought you'd steal it, David said flatly. Don't insult our intelligence with excuses. He pulled out another envelope and handed it to me. 6 weeks ago, I had DNA testing performed. I kept some of Sarah's personal effects, including hair from a brush she'd left at the office. I obtained a sample from you from a coffee cup you used during one of our meetings. I had a private lab run the analysis. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was an official laboratory report with impressive letterhead and multiple signatures. The language was technical, full of genetic markers and probability calculations, but the conclusion was clear and simple: 99% probability that the samples came from a biological mother and daughter. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of validation, of vindication. I wasn't crazy. All those years of feeling like I didn't belong, like something was fundamentally wrong, I'd been right. The absence of baby pictures, the way relatives avoided talking about my early childhood, the mysterious envelope, the late-night arguments I'd overheard, all of it pointed to a truth they'd been desperate to hide. Sarah Chen was my mother, I whispered, reading the document again to make sure it was real. Yes, David said gently. And these people have lied to you about it for 22 years. They took you in not out of love or compassion, but because it gave them access to resources and allowed them to control information about your inheritance. Justin was staring at the floor, his face pale. Mr. Patterson looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Mrs. Patterson was sobbing openly now, but I felt nothing looking at her tears. No sympathy, no forgiveness, just cold clarity. Everything you did to me, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside. Every cruel word, every sabotaged opportunity, every time you made me feel worthless, it was all to steal from me. We gave you a home, Mr. Patterson's voice cracked. "We fed you, clothed you." "With money you received for my care," David interrupted. "Which brings us to the next layer of fraud you've committed." But the lies went even deeper, all the way to the foundation of who I thought I was. David wasn't finished. He pulled out another set of documents from his briefcase, these ones with official government seals and stamps. My eyes caught the words "Certificate of Adoption" at the top of the page. "There's something else you need to know, Chelsea." David said, his voice gentler now. "Something that explains everything about why you never felt like you belonged here." He slid the documents across to me. "You're not their biological daughter. You never were." I picked up the papers with trembling hands. The adoption certificate was dated May 2003, 2 months after my mother died. The adoptive parents listed were Harold and Margaret Patterson. The child's name, Chelsea Chen. Age 5 years. Chen. Not Patterson. Chen. "Your mother's name was Sarah Chen," David said. "And the woman you've called mother your entire life is actually Sarah's younger sister, Margaret Chen. She took the name Patterson when she married Harold." I looked up at Mrs. Patterson at Margaret and saw the truth written all over her face. The tears streaming down her cheeks weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of exposure, of having a carefully constructed lie finally collapse. "You're my aunt," I said slowly, testing the words. "Sarah Chen was my real mother, and you're her sister." "Half-sister," Margaret corrected automatically, then seemed to realize how petty that sounded in the moment. "We had different fathers. She was always the special one, the smart one, the one everyone loved." The bitterness in her voice was corrosive, decades old and still fresh. David continued, pulling out more documents. "My investigation uncovered your family history. Sarah and Margaret grew up in San Francisco. Sarah was 6 years older, brilliant in mathematics and business from a young age. She got a full scholarship to Berkeley, graduated top of her class, started her career in finance while Margaret was still in high school. She got everything." Margaret spat, her composure finally cracking completely. "Education, career, success. Everyone compared me to her. Why can't you be more like Sarah? Sarah would never do that. Sarah is going places. I was invisible next to her. So when she died," I said, the picture becoming horrifyingly clear, "you saw an opportunity." "I saw a child who needed a home." Margaret's voice rose defensively. "Sarah had no one. Her husband left her the moment she got sick. She was dying alone with a 5-year-old daughter. I stepped up. I took you in when no one else would." "You took me in because of the money," I said flatly. "Because there was a trust fund and government assistance and resources you could access by claiming to care for Sarah Chen's orphaned daughter." David nodded. "When Sarah knew she was dying, she contacted Margaret, her only living family. She begged her to take you to give you a stable home. She told her about the trust fund I was setting up, asked Margaret to make sure you knew about it when you turned 25. Sarah died believing her sister would honor her wishes." I looked at Margaret, this woman I'd called mother for 20 years, and saw a stranger. "You agreed to everything she asked, and then you did the opposite." "You look just like her," Margaret whispered, staring at me with something between hatred and grief. "From the moment you came to live with us, all I could see was Sarah. Your face, your expressions, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. It was like she was haunting me through you." "So you punished me for it," I said. "You punished a 5-year-old child for reminding you of your own insecurities." "I tried to love you," Margaret said, but there was no conviction in her words. "I wanted to, but every time I looked at you, every time you succeeded at something or showed how smart you were, it was like Sarah was proving she was better than me all over again. Even dead, even through her daughter, she was still the superior one." The psychology of it was sick and twisted. This woman had spent 20 years resenting a child because that child reminded her of her own inadequacies. "That's why you could never love Chelsea." David said, his voice hard, because loving Chelsea would mean acknowledging that Sarah, even in death, had created something remarkable. And you couldn't bear that. I felt something unexpected wash over me then. Not anger, not grief, but relief. Pure, crystalline relief. I always knew I didn't belong here, I said quietly. From my earliest memories, I felt like an outsider in my own home. I spent my entire childhood wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't make you love me no matter how hard I tried or how perfect I was. I looked at Margaret directly. But it was never about me, was it? It was about her. About my real mother. You couldn't stand that she was brilliant and successful and good, so you tried to destroy those qualities in me. You tried to make me small and worthless, so you wouldn't have to see Sarah in my face every day. Margaret's sobs had dissolved into hiccuping gasps. She had no defense because everything I was saying was true. You took in a 5-year-old orphan who just lost her mother to cancer. I continued, my voice steady despite the tears on my own cheeks. A child who needed love and security and family. And you punished her for 20 years for the crime of reminding you of someone you were jealous of. You had 2 decades to be decent, to choose compassion over resentment. And you chose cruelty instead. Every single day, you chose cruelty. Harold Patterson, the man I'd called father, had been silent through all of this. But now he spoke. We gave you a good home. Food, shelter, education. You gave me the legal minimum required to avoid Child Protective Services investigating. I cut him off. And you did it with money that was meant for my care. You didn't do me any favors. You did your legal obligation while making me feel like garbage every single day. David pulled out yet another document. Speaking of legal obligations, we need to discuss the various crimes you've committed. Because emotional abuse, while morally reprehensible, is just the beginning of your legal troubles. Margaret looked up, fear replacing the defensive anger in her eyes. What are you talking about? I'm talking about welfare fraud, David said coldly. Identity theft, breach of fiduciary duty, tax evasion. Should I continue? But they'd committed far worse crimes than emotional abuse crimes that carried legal consequences. David pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the last. I hired a forensic accountant and a team of attorneys to investigate your financial history. What they found goes beyond emotional abuse into clear criminal territory. He spread out bank statements, government forms, and highlighted financial records across the coffee table like he was building a case, which I realized he was. From June 2003 to June 2021, the Pattersons received monthly child welfare assistance payments of $1,200. David said, his finger tracing down a column of numbers. That's 18 years of payments. Total received $216,000. I stared at the numbers, my brain struggling to process. $216,000. In my name. For my care. These weren't general welfare payments, David continued. They were specifically designated assistance for a minor child with documented medical needs and for educational support. The application your mother filed before she died with Margaret's signature as the prospective guardian clearly stated that you had a minor congenital heart condition requiring annual monitoring. I have a what? The words came out sharper than I intended. David's expression softened with something like pity. A congenital heart condition. It's documented in your medical records from when you were born. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but it requires regular cardiology checkups and monitoring. Your mother made sure the welfare application included funds specifically for your ongoing medical care. I turned to Margaret, fury building in my chest. I have a heart condition and you never told me. She wouldn't meet my eyes. It was minor. The doctor said it probably wouldn't cause problems. Probably. I stood up, my hands shaking. You gambled with my health because you wanted to keep the money. David held up a hand. Chelsea, sit down. There's more and you need to hear all of it. I sat, but I couldn't stop trembling. According to the guidelines for this assistance program, the funds were to be used for annual cardiology appointments, any necessary medications and educational support, including tutoring, school supplies, and college preparation, David explained. Can you tell me, Chelsea, when was the last time you saw a cardiologist? I've never seen a cardiologist, I said numbly. I didn't even know I needed one. Exactly. David pulled out more bank statements. The forensic accountant traced where this money actually went. Justin's private elementary school tuition, $8,000 per year for 6 years. A new Lexus for Harold Patterson in 2010, $42,000. A kitchen renovation in 2015, $38,000. The pattern continues. None of it, not $1, went to Chelsea's medical care or educational needs. Harold finally found his voice. We used our own money for Chelsea's expenses. The welfare was just supplemental income. That's not how designated assistance works. David cut him off. You were legally required to use those specific funds for Chelsea's specific needs. Instead, you committed welfare fraud on a massive scale. He slid another document across the table. I've already been in contact with the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services and the Federal Office of Inspector General. They're very interested in your case. Welfare fraud of this magnitude carries serious penalties. Full repayment of all funds received penalties that can double or triple the original amount and criminal prosecution. Margaret's face had gone gray. How much are you talking about? Conservatively, $400,000 in repayment and penalties, David said. And that's if they're feeling generous. You could also face 2 to 5 years in federal prison. The room spun. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to steady myself. They'd stolen money meant to keep me healthy, money meant to help me get educated, and spent it on themselves while making me feel like I should be grateful for scraps. There's something else, David said, his voice gentler now as he looked at me. Chelsea, when was the last time you applied for a car loan or tried to rent an apartment? I thought back. About 3 years ago. I got denied for both. I assumed it was because my income was too low and I didn't have much credit history. That's what they wanted you to think. David handed me a credit report with my name at the top. The real reason you were denied is because, according to your credit report, you had $35,000 in delinquent debt across 4 credit cards. I stared at the report. There were cards from banks I'd never contacted with balances I'd never accumulated, showing years of missed payments. I never opened these accounts, I said. I know, Justin did. David gestured to my brother, who'd been sitting silently on the couch, his face pale. In 2019, he used your social security number to open credit cards in your name. He maxed them out online gambling mostly and never made a single payment. He destroyed your credit score while you had no idea it was happening. I turned to Justin, rage boiling over. You stole my identity. You ruined my credit. He couldn't look at me. I was going to pay it back. I just needed some cash to get started, and Mom said you wouldn't mind because we were family. I did mind, I shouted. I minded every single thing you people did to me. I minded being treated like a servant. I minded being told I was worthless. I minded working 3 jobs while you sat around playing video games. And I definitely mind you committing federal crimes using my name. David placed a calming hand on my shoulder. My attorneys have already filed identity theft reports with all 3 credit bureaus and with federal law enforcement. The fraudulent accounts are being removed from your credit history. But Justin faces serious federal charges: identity theft, credit card fraud, wire fraud. We're talking potential prison time. Justin's mother, Margaret, reached for him instinctively, but he pulled away. There's one more thing, David said, pulling out a final set of documents. This one connects to something you told me about Chelsea, the scholarship you lost in 2018, the one that was mysteriously withdrawn from your email account. My heart stopped. You found out who did it? We did. And it wasn't just Justin acting on impulse. David's expression hardened as he looked at Margaret. It was a coordinated effort between mother and son, a conspiracy to ensure Chelsea never got the education that might lead her to financial advisors or lawyers who could help her discover her inheritance. And then we discovered who had really stolen my scholarship, and it was worse than I imagined. David pulled out his laptop and opened it on the coffee table. The scholarship sabotage required a court order to obtain email records from your university and from Margaret's personal accounts. What we found was illuminating. He turned the screen so I could see. There were dozens of emails organized chronologically, highlighted and annotated. In March 2018, you were nominated for the Sanderson Transfer Scholarship, David said. The notification email was sent to your university email address. But what you didn't know is that Margaret had set up an automatic forwarding rule on your account. That's impossible, I said. She wouldn't have had access to my university email. She had access to your laptop, David replied. The old one you used during your first year of community college. Do you remember leaving it at their house? I did remember. I'd upgraded to a used laptop I'd bought from a classmate and left the old one in my childhood bedroom thinking it was worthless. I didn't think anyone would bother with it. Margaret installed spyware on it before you took it with you, David said. Basic keystroke logging software. Every password you typed, every account you accessed from that laptop, she had a record of it. When you changed laptops, she already had your university email credentials. She set up the forwarding rule so that any email containing certain keywords, scholarship, financial aid, award, opportunity, would automatically forward to an email address she controlled. The violation of it made me feel sick. She'd been watching me, monitoring my communications, waiting for opportunities to sabotage. David clicked through the emails. On March 15, 2018, you received the scholarship nomination notification. Margaret received a copy 3 seconds later. Within an hour, she'd forwarded it to Justin with this message. He highlighted an email. I read it, my hands shaking. This is it. This is the opportunity we were worried about. If she gets into a 4-year university, she'll have access to financial aid counselors, career advisors, maybe even legal services for students. Someone will eventually help her discover the trust. We can't let that happen. You need to withdraw her application. I'll send you instructions. Mom was terrified. Justin said quietly from the couch, his voice hollow. She kept saying that if you found out about the money, you'd leave and we'd lose everything. She made it sound like you were the selfish one, like you were going to abandon the family. I wasn't part of your family, I said, my voice shaking with fury. I was your victim. David clicked to the next email. Margaret sent Justin detailed instructions on how to access your account using the credentials she'd stolen. She told him to submit a withdrawal request using your student ID and personal information, making it look like you'd changed your mind about the scholarship. I didn't want to do it, Justin said, tears streaming down his face now. I felt wrong about it. But Mom said we were protecting the family, that you didn't appreciate everything we'd sacrificed for you. What did you sacrifice? I demanded. You lived off money that was meant for my medical care. You went to private school on funds designated for my education. What exactly did you sacrifice, Justin? He had no answer. You were 19 years old, David said to Justin. Legally an adult. You made a choice to commit fraud. You accessed a computer system without authorization, submitted false information to a scholarship foundation, and destroyed an opportunity worth $120,000. Those are federal computer crimes. He pulled up another document. I contacted the Sanderson Scholarship Foundation. They confirmed that if they'd known in 2018 that the withdrawal was fraudulent, they would have immediately reported it to law enforcement and pressed charges. The statute of limitations for computer fraud in Ohio is 6 years. It's been 5 years and 8 months. You can still be prosecuted. Justin looked like he might be sick, but David wasn't done. He turned to Margaret. You want to paint yourself as a concerned mother protecting her family. Let's look at exactly what you've been protecting them from. He pulled up more emails, these ones going back years. After the scholarship incident, I had the investigators look deeper. What they found was a pattern of systematic sabotage spanning Chelsea's entire adult life. Email after email appeared on the screen. Margaret contacting scholarship committees claiming I had behavioral issues and disciplinary problems that weren't in my records. Margaret calling a professor who'd offered to mentor me, telling him I'd dropped out of school entirely, a complete lie. Margaret emailing my community college academic advisor saying I was dealing with serious family emergencies and asking them not to offer me any special opportunities because I couldn't handle the pressure. "You monster," I whispered, reading email after email. "You spent years actively destroying my future. I was protecting my son." Margaret screamed, her composure completely shattered. "You had everything. Your mother's intelligence, her opportunities, that trust fund waiting for you. Justin had nothing except what we could give him. I had to level the playing field." "Level the playing field?" David's voice was ice cold. "You stole $200,000 in welfare funds. You hid a $7.8 million inheritance. You sabotaged countless opportunities. You committed multiple federal crimes. And you call that leveling the playing field?" He stood up, his full height and authority filling the room. "You're not a mother, Margaret. You're a thief. You're a fraud. And you're going to pay for every single crime you've committed." Margaret collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. Harold sat next to her, looking 10 years older than he had 2 hours ago. Justin stared at the floor, his whole body shaking. And I sat there surrounded by the evidence of 22 years of systematic abuse and betrayal, feeling emotions I couldn't name. David turned to me. "Chelsea, I have enough evidence here to pursue criminal charges on multiple fronts: welfare fraud, identity theft, computer crimes, conspiracy to commit fraud. The decision about how to proceed is yours." The room went silent. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my decision. For 22 years, I'd had no power in this family. No voice, no choice. Every decision had been made for me, every opportunity stolen from me, every chance at happiness sabotaged by people who were supposed to protect me. Now, for the first time, I held all the power. Their futures were in my hands. That's when I made a decision that would change all of their lives, including my own. I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Everyone in the room was frozen, waiting for my verdict. David stood ready with his legal team on speed dial. Margaret sobbed quietly into her hands. Harold stared at the floor. Justin looked like he wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. 22 years of lies, theft, manipulation, and cruelty. $216,000 stolen. A $7.8 million inheritance hidden. A scholarship sabotaged. My credit destroyed. My health endangered. My entire life built on a foundation of systematic abuse designed to keep me powerless and ignorant. I had every right to press charges. Every legal ground to send all 3 of them to prison. David had handed me the power to destroy them as thoroughly as they'd tried to destroy me. But as I looked at them, these broken, pathetic people who'd spent decades consumed by resentment and greed, I realized something. Revenge wouldn't heal me. Prison sentences wouldn't give me back the childhood they'd stolen, or the opportunities they'd sabotaged. Punishment alone wouldn't make them understand what they'd done. It would just make them victims in their own narrative, people who'd been persecuted by an ungrateful daughter who'd turned on the family that raised her. I wanted something different, something harder than prison. I wanted them to actually change. "I won't decide right now," I said, finally, my voice steady. "About the criminal charges, I mean. But I'll make you an offer." David looked at me with surprise. Margaret's head snapped up, hope flickering in her red-rimmed eyes. "If you want any chance of avoiding prison," I continued, "you'll do exactly what I say for the next 6 months. And I mean exactly. No negotiation, no excuses, no half measures. You follow my terms completely, or I have David file every charge his attorneys have prepared. Do you understand?" Harold found his voice first. "What kind of terms?" "Accountability," I said simply. "Real accountability, not the fake apologies you're probably already preparing in your heads." I stood up and began pacing, organizing my thoughts. "First condition, public acknowledgement. You're going to contact every person you lied to, every institution you defrauded, and you're going to tell them the truth. Specific truth. Detailed truth." Margaret started to protest, but I held up my hand. Harold, you'll write a letter to the Sanderson Scholarship Foundation explaining exactly what happened, that your wife installed spyware on my computer, that your son accessed my email illegally, that you conspired to withdraw my application to prevent me from getting an education that might help me discover my inheritance. You'll explain all of it. Harold's face went gray. That will destroy my reputation in the business community. You mean the reputation you built on lies? I asked coldly. Yes, it will. That's the point. I turned to Margaret. You'll contact every scholarship committee, every mentor, every academic advisor you lied to about me. You'll send written apologies explaining that you fabricated behavioral problems, made up family emergencies, and spread false information to sabotage my opportunities. You'll explain why you did it to hide an inheritance and keep me dependent. The whole community will know, she whispered. Yes, I said. You wanted me to be invisible and ashamed my entire life. Now you'll know what that feels like. Every person you lied to will know the truth about who you really are. I looked at Justin. You'll contact every credit bureau, every debt collector, every institution connected to the accounts you opened in my name. You'll submit written confessions that you committed identity theft. You'll work with David's attorneys to clear my credit completely. And you'll face the financial consequences of your own debt instead of hiding behind my stolen identity. Justin's voice was barely audible. They'll prosecute me. Maybe, I said. That's a risk you'll have to take. You committed the crime. You face the consequences. I sat back down, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Second condition community service. 200 hours each. Not picking up trash on the highway where no one has to look at you. Real service at organizations that help the people you victimized. David was watching me with something like admiration, but he stayed silent, letting me lead. You'll volunteer at homeless shelters, I continued, at food banks, at youth mentoring programs for foster children and at-risk kids. You'll work with the exact populations you stole from when you defrauded the welfare system. You'll see their faces. You'll hear their stories. You'll understand that your crimes had real victims beyond just me. That's humiliating, Margaret said. No, I corrected her. Humiliating is being called the housekeeper in your own home. Humiliating is being told you're kept out of pity. What I'm offering you is a chance to develop empathy you should have had all along. I leaned forward, making sure they understood every word. You'll show up every week. You'll do actual work. You'll engage with the people you're serving like they're human beings who deserve respect. And if I hear one single complaint about your attitude or effort, if you show up late, if you're rude, if you treat this like some box to check the deal is off immediately, and I prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. Harold tried one more time. Chelsea, please. We made mistakes, but we're still family. We are not family, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't sabotage each other's futures. Family doesn't commit crimes against each other for 2 decades. You're strangers who happen to have legal custody of me. That's all you've ever been. The words landed like physical blows. I could see them flinch. This isn't mercy, I said quietly. This is me giving you a chance to become people who might someday deserve mercy. Whether you take that chance or not is up to you. But these are my terms. Accept them, or I walk out of here right now and let David file every charge. The silence stretched. Finally, Harold nodded. We accept. All 3 of you, I said, looking at Margaret and Justin. Margaret nodded reluctantly. Justin did the same. Good, I said. David will draw up the agreement. You'll sign it, and starting tomorrow you'll begin making it right. I stood up to leave, exhausted beyond words. David gathered his documents and followed me to the door. But I didn't realize karma was already working behind the scenes, and it was about to hit them harder than anything I could do. I left the Patterson house that night and didn't look back. David drove me to my apartment in silence, both of us processing what had just happened. When he dropped me off, he said, You were remarkably restrained in there, more merciful than they deserved." "We'll see if they actually change," I said. "I'm not holding my breath." What I didn't know was that even as I was offering them a path to redemption, the natural consequences of their actions were already in motion. I hadn't set those wheels turning, they'd done that themselves years ago. I was just the catalyst that made everything visible. The first domino fell within 72 hours. Harold Patterson had been working as a financial consultant for 4 different firms, providing advice on investment strategies and risk management. It was decent money, not enough to sustain their expensive lifestyle, but enough to keep them afloat while they continued spending money they didn't have. His reputation in the business community was built on relationships and trust. When those started to crumble, his career collapsed with stunning speed. David told me later what happened, though he hadn't orchestrated it. After that Christmas dinner, word spread through professional networks about what had transpired. People talked. Questions were asked. And when business associates contacted David for references on Harold Patterson, as they routinely did when considering consultants, David simply told the truth. "I cannot recommend Mr. Patterson due to serious personal integrity concerns that have recently come to light." In corporate America, that single sentence is a death sentence. It's professional code for, "This person cannot be trusted." David didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That one carefully worded statement was enough. Within 3 weeks, Harold lost all 4 consulting contracts. The firms didn't give detailed explanations, they just terminated his services with vague language about restructuring and going in a different direction. But Harold knew. I knew. Everyone knew. The income that had been sustaining the family vanished overnight. The money they'd been using to pay Justin's credit card bills, to maintain their house, to keep up appearances, gone. David hadn't sabotaged Harold. He'd simply stopped protecting him from the natural consequences of his own reputation. The business community had made its own judgment. The second consequence came from the government. When David's attorneys filed their initial complaints about the welfare fraud, it triggered automatic reviews from multiple agencies. The Internal Revenue Service and the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services both launched audits of the Patterson household finances going back to 2003. What they found was damning. The Pattersons had received $216,000 in welfare assistance over 18 years. That money, while technically non-taxable, should have been reported on their tax returns for record-keeping purposes. They'd never reported a single dollar of it. More seriously, they'd been claiming me as a dependent on their taxes for years, claiming tax credits and deductions for supporting a child they weren't actually supporting. I'd been financially independent since I was 18, working multiple jobs and supporting myself. But every year they'd filed tax returns claiming they were supporting me, reducing their tax burden by thousands of dollars annually. The IRS calculated the total amount owed approximately $180,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. They were offered a payment plan, $3,200 per month, for 5 years. Without Harold's consulting income, that amount was impossible. They couldn't make even the first payment. The third consequence hit Justin hardest. He'd been unemployed for months, living at home, but after the Christmas disaster, he finally started seriously job hunting. He updated his resume, claiming he'd been considered for executive training programs at Whitmore Enterprises and had consulted on major restructuring projects. When potential employers called David's company to verify, they got a very different story. Justin had never been interviewed. He'd never been considered for any position. In fact, he'd been specifically excluded from consideration due to integrity concerns. His resume was exposed as a fabrication. Combined with the now public identity theft charges and credit card fraud, Justin became virtually unemployable in any professional capacity. No reputable firm would touch him. He ended up taking a job stocking shelves at a big box retail store for $14.50 an hour. It was honest work, but it was a far cry from the executive career his parents had envisioned for him. For the first time in his 25 years, Justin was experiencing what I'd lived through: the exhaustion of minimum wage work. The humiliation of financial insecurity, the reality that the world doesn't owe you anything. Margaret watched her son come home each night in a retail uniform, exhausted and defeated, and I imagine it killed her to see the golden child reduced to the same level as the niece she'd spent 2 decades trying to keep down. But that was just the beginning. The real catastrophe was still coming. And then the final blow came, the one that took everything they had left. The final blow came 6 weeks after that Christmas dinner delivered by certified mail from First National Bank. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. 3 missed mortgage payments. 90 days to vacate the premises. I only knew about it because Margaret called me, her voice thick with tears, begging me to intervene. I didn't. This wasn't my doing. It was the inevitable collapse of a financial house of cards they'd been building for decades. Without Harold's consulting income, they had no way to make the monthly mortgage payment of $2,800. They'd already been stretched thin before living beyond their means, maintaining appearances they couldn't afford. The IRS debt, the welfare repayment demands, and the loss of Harold's income created a perfect storm of financial catastrophe. What I didn't know until David told me later was that they'd taken out a second mortgage 8 years earlier. Harold had given Justin $40,000 to start a business venture, some kind of dropshipping scheme that Justin had been convinced would make him rich. The business lasted 4 months before collapsing, taking every dollar with it. They'd been paying on that second mortgage ever since, bleeding money to cover Justin's failed dream. Now both mortgages were in default. The house they'd lived in for 22 years, the house they'd renovated with money stolen from my medical fund, was being taken by the bank. They tried everything to save it, applied for refinancing, and were rejected. Their debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic. Tried to negotiate with the bank for modified terms and were denied. Their credit scores had plummeted as the investigations became public. Even attempted to sell the house quickly, but in their panic, they'd priced it too high and couldn't find a buyer within the 90-day window. 3 months after receiving the foreclosure notice, they moved out. I heard about it through David, who heard through the professional network that still gossiped about the Patterson family's spectacular fall from grace. They'd rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a lower-income neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland, the kind of area they'd spent years looking down on, the kind of place where people like me had lived while working multiple jobs just to survive. I drove past it once out of curiosity more than anything else. It was a squat brick building with 4 units, laundry lines visible in the small yards, cars that had seen better days parked on the street. Clean, but humble. The kind of place where people worked hard for every dollar and didn't waste money on appearances. The kind of place I'd lived in for years. David's investigator provided more details, though I hadn't asked for them. Harold slept on the living room couch because the apartment only had 2 bedrooms. Margaret and Justin shared the larger bedroom, awkwardly divided by a sheet hung from the ceiling for some semblance of privacy. 2 adults who should have been living independent lives crammed into a space neither wanted to share, both too broke to afford anything else. Their expensive furniture, the leather sofas, the dining set, the king-size bed, none of it fit in the apartment. Most of it went to a consignment shop where they got pennies on the dollar. Margaret apparently cried as strangers loaded her china cabinet into a truck, the crystal and fine china she'd been so proud of selling for a fraction of what she'd paid. She'd traded her integrity for material possessions, and now even those were gone. The psychological impact from what I heard through mutual acquaintances who still lived in their old neighborhood was devastating in different ways for each of them. Harold became withdrawn and depressed, spending his days on the couch staring at nothing. When he did speak, it was usually to snap at Margaret, blaming her for ruining everything with her schemes and lies. He conveniently ignored that he'd been a willing participant in every fraud, that he'd spent the welfare money as freely as she had, that he'd known about the trust fund and chosen to hide it. Margaret oscillated between self-pity and bitter resentment. Some days she'd cry about how far they'd fallen, how humiliated she felt shopping at discount stores and riding the bus because they'd sold their second car. Other days she'd lash out in anger, blaming me for destroying the family before catching herself and remembering that no, they'd destroyed themselves. I'd just made the destruction visible. Justin was perhaps the most affected. His entire identity had been built on being superior to me, smarter, more valuable, more deserving. His parents had spent 25 years reinforcing that narrative, telling him he was special while I was disposable. Now he worked at Target for $15 an hour, stocking shelves and cleaning up spills while I was a successful executive with nearly $8 million in the bank. The cognitive dissonance was destroying him. Every time he put on that red polo shirt with the name tag he was confronted with, the reality that everything he'd believed about himself was a lie. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering. Contrary to what Margaret apparently told people, I hadn't orchestrated their downfall. I'd simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own actions. The rest, the lost jobs, the IRS audit, the foreclosure, that was all them. Seeds they'd planted years ago finally bearing bitter fruit. They'd built their lives on fraud, theft, and lies. When the foundation crumbled, everything collapsed with it. 2 months after they moved into the apartment, Margaret called me again. Her voice was different this time, not demanding or accusatory, but defeated, desperate. "Chelsea, we need to talk. Please, just once. We need your help." I almost said no, almost hung up and blocked her number. But something in her voice made me hesitate. "Fine," I said. "Coffee shop on Euclid Avenue. Tomorrow at 2. You have 30 minutes. With nowhere else to turn and nothing left to lose, they came to me begging, but not for what I expected. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a table near the back with a clear view of the entrance. Old habits from years of being hypervigilant in their presence. I ordered a coffee I didn't drink and waited. They arrived exactly on time, the three of them together looking like refugees from their former lives. Harold wore a wrinkled button-down shirt that had seen better days. Margaret's coat was threadbare at the cuffs. Justin had dark circles under his eyes and the defeated posture of someone who'd been working retail for months. They looked broken, tired. The weight of consequences visible in every line on their faces, every slump of their shoulders. Harold did most of the talking. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the table. Justin wouldn't meet my eyes. "Chelsea, we know we can't undo what we did," Harold began, his voice lacking its usual authority. "We know we hurt you. We know we were wrong." The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in front of a mirror. "But we're drowning here. We're facing over $600,000 in debts between the IRS, the welfare repayment, and everything else. The government is demanding money we don't have. We could go to prison." He paused, and I saw him gathering courage for what came next. "You have $7.8 million now," he said. And there it was, the real reason for this meeting. "You could pay our debts and never even notice the money missing. It would solve everything. We could start over, do better, be the family we should have been." He leaned forward, trying to project sincerity. "Please, Chelsea, we're family. We raised you. Doesn't that count for something?" The audacity was almost impressive. After everything they'd done, everything that had been exposed, they were still trying to manipulate me. Still believed that blood relation, even the twisted version of it we shared, entitled them to my resources. I let the silence stretch, watching them squirm. Margaret finally looked up, hope flickering in her red-rimmed eyes. Justin leaned forward slightly, clearly desperate for me to agree. "You're right about some things," I said finally, my voice calm and measured. "I do have resources now. And you're right that this amount of money could solve your immediate financial problems." Their faces brightened. Harold started to smile. Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly. "But I'm not giving you a single dollar." The hope died so quickly it was almost comical. Harold's smile froze and cracked. Margaret's face crumpled. Justin slumped back in his chair. "Chelsea, please," Harold started. I held up my hand. "Let me finish. I'm not giving you money, not because I'm cruel or vengeful, but because paying your debts would be the worst thing I could possibly do for you. You'd learn nothing. You'd face no real consequences. In 6 months or a year, You'd be right back to your old patterns because you never actually changed. You'd just have been bailed out. We would change. Margaret insisted, her voice desperate. We'd be different. We'd appreciate— No, you wouldn't, I interrupted. Because money doesn't fix what's broken in you. Money doesn't teach empathy or accountability or basic human decency. You don't need a financial bailout. You need a fundamental transformation. And that can't be bought. It has to be earned through real work, real consequences, and real growth. Harold's face had gone from hopeful to angry. So you're just going to let us rot, let us go to prison? I'm going to let you face the consequences of your own actions, I corrected. Something you've avoided your entire lives. But that doesn't mean I'm abandoning you to destroy yourselves completely. I pulled a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Here's what I will do. I've contacted a nonprofit credit counseling service that specializes in massive debt situations. They'll help you create a realistic repayment plan with the IRS and welfare agencies. It won't be comfortable, but it will be manageable if you're willing to work. Margaret opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the documents inside. I've also found you a bankruptcy attorney who'll work on a sliding scale if the debt truly becomes impossible. I continued. And I've contacted a social services agency that can help ensure you don't become homeless while you're working through this. You'll have housing assistance applications, food resources, job placement services, everything you need to survive while you rebuild. But we'll still have to pay back hundreds of thousands of dollars, Harold said bitterly. Yes, I agreed. Over 10 years, maybe 15. You'll be on payment plans for a long time. You'll live modestly. You'll work hard. You'll face the reality of what you did. That's not help, Justin said, speaking for the first time. That's just letting us suffer. No, I said firmly. Helping you would be enabling you to avoid growth. What I'm offering is support, while you do the hard work of becoming better people. There's a difference. I pointed to another section of the folder. You'll also continue the community service I required, 200 hours each at organizations serving the populations you victimized, and you'll attend therapy, family therapy together, and individual therapy for each of you. The counseling service has therapists who work on a sliding scale. Therapy? Margaret's voice was thick with disdain. We don't need therapy. We need money. You need both, I said. But you're only getting one from me, and it's not money. You need to understand why you did what you did, why you chose cruelty over compassion, why you valued material possessions over human relationships, why you thought it was acceptable to abuse a child for 20 years. I leaned forward, making sure they heard every word. This folder contains contact information for every resource you need. The counselors are expecting you. The credit service has already pulled your information and started preliminary work. The social services agency has your application ready. Everything is set up. The only question is, will you actually do the work? Harold looked at the folder like it was a prison sentence, which in a way it was just a different kind than he'd been fearing. And if we don't, he asked. Then I proceed with criminal prosecution, I said simply. David's attorneys are ready to file charges whenever I give the word. You go to prison, you lose any chance at rebuilding your lives, and you spend the next 5 to 10 years understanding consequences the hard way. The silence stretched. I could see them processing, weighing their options, realizing they had no leverage and no alternatives. Finally, Harold nodded. We'll do it. All three of you, I said, looking at Margaret and Justin. Margaret nodded reluctantly. Justin did the same, though he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Good, I said, standing up. The credit counselor expects your call tomorrow. Don't make me regret giving you this chance. I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back. They'd agreed to the terms. They'd promised to do the work. But I soon learned that agreeing and changing are two very different things. I'd set up the community service and therapy requirements with the expectation that change would be difficult. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how resistant they would be to even the possibility of growth. The first incident report came 3 weeks into Justin's community service at the Cleveland Youth Mentoring Center. The coordinator, a woman named Patricia who'd been working with at-risk teens for 15 years, called me directly. "I need to talk to you about Justin Patterson," she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "We've had several issues with his attitude and behavior." My stomach sank. "What kind of issues?" "He's on his phone constantly during sessions. He shows up but doesn't engage. Yesterday, a 16-year-old boy in foster care, a kid who's had a really rough time and is trying so hard to stay on track, asked Justin for advice about staying motivated in school. And Justin told him, and I quote, 'Honestly, school doesn't matter that much. I barely graduated and I was fine until recently.'" Patricia's voice rose with indignation. "He's supposed to be mentoring these kids, giving them hope and guidance, and instead he's telling them education is pointless. When I confronted him about it, he said he was just being honest." I closed my eyes, rage and disappointment washing over me in equal measure. "I'm so sorry, Patricia. That's completely unacceptable." "There's more," she continued. "When I suggested he actually try to connect with the kids, try to understand their struggles, he said, 'Why do I have to pretend to care about these kids? I'm only here because my sister is forcing me.' Of course he did. Justin still saw this as punishment, rather than an opportunity to develop basic human compassion. He was going through the motions, checking boxes, serving his time without any actual engagement with why he was there. "He's done," I said. "Pull him from the program immediately. I'll deal with him." "Actually," Patricia said, her tone shifting slightly, "I'd like to give him one more chance, but only if you allow me to assign him to work with Marcus." "Who's Marcus?" "Our toughest volunteer coordinator. Former Marine, works with the most challenging kids. If anyone can break through Justin's attitude, it's him. But I need your permission to be harder on Justin than we'd normally be with volunteers." I hesitated, then nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Do it. And if he doesn't shape up after that, he's out and I'm filing charges." Margaret's reports were less dramatic but equally disappointing. She showed up to her shifts at the community food bank, signed in, did the minimum required work, and left without connecting with anyone. The volunteer coordinator there, a kind older man named Robert, called it surface-level compliance. Margaret wore her old designer sunglasses, kept her purse close, and maintained obvious physical distance from the families she was serving. She bagged groceries, mechanically organized donations efficiently, but treated the people receiving help like they were invisible. "She works hard," Robert told me during a check-in call. "I can't fault her effort in terms of tasks completed, but she's missing the entire point. Yesterday I suggested she try talking to some of the families, hearing their stories, understanding what brought them here. You know what she said?" "What?" "I'm doing what was required. I'm here, aren't I?" Robert sighed. "She thinks this is about hours served and boxes checked. She doesn't understand it's about empathy, about seeing herself in these people, about recognizing that circumstances and choices put them here just like circumstances and choices put her here." The therapy sessions with Harold were perhaps the most frustrating because he was so skilled at appearing compliant while avoiding actual growth. Dr. Lisa Chen, the therapist I'd arranged for their family sessions, requested a private conversation with me after their 4th session. "Your father is very intelligent," she said carefully. "And he's using that intelligence to avoid genuine reflection." "What do you mean? He intellectualizes everything. When I ask him to discuss his feelings about what he did to you, he launches into abstract discussions about systemic pressures on middle-class families or societal expectations of parental success. When I try to get him to take personal accountability, he deflects with statements like, 'Plenty of families have dysfunction, we're not unique,' or 'Chelsea is overreacting to normal family conflict.'" I felt my jaw clench. "So he's learned nothing. He's learned how to look like he's participating in therapy without actually being vulnerable or honest," Dr. Chen corrected. "He shows up on time, he engages intellectually, he uses all the right therapeutic language. but he's not doing the internal work. He wants credit for being in therapy without actually changing. It was predictable, really. Harold had spent his entire life maintaining appearances while avoiding genuine accountability. Why would therapy be any different? I spent 3 months watching them stumble through the requirements I'd set, each of them finding their own way to comply without actually transforming. Justin with open hostility, Margaret with mechanical detachment, Harold with intellectual deflection. I was exhausted, disappointed, ready to give up on the whole experiment and just let David file the criminal charges. Then David called me with an unexpected suggestion. "I'd like to visit their community service sites," he said. "Talk to them directly. I think they need to hear some hard truths from someone who isn't you, someone they can't dismiss as biased or vindictive." "You think you can get through to them?" "I don't know," David admitted. "But I'd like to try. They're not just your problem, Chelsea. What they did to you, to Sarah's memory, that's personal to me too. And sometimes people need to hear difficult truths from unexpected sources." I was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. "Okay," I said. "Do it." I was ready to give up on them, but then someone unexpected stepped in to deliver the lesson they needed. David didn't tell me he was going to the youth center. He just showed up one Tuesday afternoon dressed in jeans and a plain work shirt, looking nothing like the CEO who commanded million-dollar boardrooms. Justin told me about it later, his voice shaken in a way I'd never heard before. David had walked into the mentoring center and simply started helping. He grabbed chairs, set up tables for the after-school program, worked alongside the other volunteers without introducing himself or drawing attention. Justin was half-heartedly arranging art supplies, checking his phone every few minutes, when he noticed someone working efficiently next to him. It took him almost an hour to recognize David Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore!" Justin's voice had apparently gone up an octave. "What are you doing here?" David kept working, arranging tables in neat rows. "Same thing you should be doing, serving people who deserve better than they've gotten." Justin stammered something about not expecting to see him, about this being community service, about how awkward this was. David finally looked at him directly. "These kids remind me of Chelsea," he said. "Bright, capable, dealt a bad hand by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Most of them are in foster care or transitional housing. They've been abandoned, neglected, told they're worthless. Sound familiar?" Justin had gone pale. "The difference is, Chelsea fought through it," David continued. "She refused to let other people's cruelty define her. These kids need mentors who'll show them how to do the same. Instead, they have you, someone who's just marking time, checking boxes, waiting for this punishment to be over." "I'm doing what Chelsea required," Justin said defensively. "No, you're doing the bare minimum to avoid prison," David corrected. "There's a difference." He gestured for Justin to sit down, then away from the other volunteers, and that's when the real conversation happened. "My father was a factory worker," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "He worked the line at a manufacturing plant for 30 years. He was also an alcoholic. Mean drunk. He told me I'd amount to nothing just like he had, that I was stupid for thinking I could do better." Justin had looked up, surprised. This wasn't the successful CEO narrative he'd expected. "For years I believed him," David continued. "I barely graduated high school, worked dead-end jobs, drank too much. I was becoming him, and I hated it. I hated myself." "What changed?" Justin asked. "I realized I didn't have to be him," David said simply. "I could choose differently, but it required work, real, painful, honest work on myself. I had to face what I was becoming. I had to admit that I was using my father's abuse as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for my own choices. I had to stop just showing up to life and actually start living it intentionally." He'd paused, looking at Justin with an expression that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite judgment either. "You're not a bad person, Justin," David said. "You're a product of bad parenting. Your mother raised you to believe you were superior to Chelsea, that you deserved things without earning them, that other people existed to serve your needs. That's not your fault. You didn't choose that programming." Justin had started to relax slightly, but David wasn't finished. "But you're 25 years old now," David continued, his voice harder. "At some point you become responsible for who you choose to be next. You can keep blaming your parents, keep going through the motions, keep treating this like punishment you have to endure. Or you can actually choose to become someone better. Someone who earns respect instead of expecting it. Someone who gives instead of just taking." According to Justin, they'd sat there for a long time in silence after that. Finally, David had stood up. "The question is, what will you choose?" Then he'd walked out, leaving Justin sitting alone with thoughts he'd been avoiding for 25 years. David didn't stop with Justin. Over the next week, he visited Margaret at the food bank and Harold at the homeless shelter where he'd been assigned to work. I heard about Margaret's encounter from Robert, the volunteer coordinator. David had apparently approached Margaret while she was mechanically bagging groceries, maintaining her usual distance from the families receiving food. "Margaret," David had said quietly, and she'd looked up shocked to see him there. They'd stepped outside away from the other volunteers. "Your sister Sarah was one of the most compassionate people I've ever known," David told her. "She saw people really saw them. She believed that everyone deserved dignity and second chances. She built our company on those principles." Margaret had tried to say something, but David held up his hand. "Sarah would be heartbroken to see what you've become," he continued. "To see what you did to her daughter. You took a child who'd lost her mother and turned her into your emotional punching bag because you couldn't handle your own jealousy and inadequacy." Margaret had broken down then, Robert said. 20 years of resentment and defensiveness cracking open ugly sobs that she couldn't control. David hadn't comforted her. He'd just stood there, letting her feel the full weight of what she'd done. "You can't undo it," he'd said finally. "But you can stop making it worse. You can start actually seeing the people here, seeing yourself in them. You're one bad decision away from being on the other side of this table. That should terrify you into empathy." With Harold, David's approach was different, more direct, more cutting. The homeless shelter coordinator told me that David had found Harold during his evening shift helping prepare cots for the night's residents. "You're a smart man," David had said without preamble. "Smart enough to know that what you did to Chelsea was monstrous even if you won't admit it." Harold had tried to defend himself to explain, but David cut him off. "I don't want your excuses," David said. "I want you to answer one question when you look in the mirror. Who do you see? Because from where I'm standing, I see a man who spent 22 years stealing from a child, who let his wife torture his niece because it was easier than being decent, who built his entire life on lies and theft and called it being a good father." Harold had gone red-faced angry, but David's authority, his complete lack of investment in Harold's approval, made it impossible to deflect. "The question isn't whether you can fool your therapist or complete your service hours," David said. "The question is whether you can look at yourself honestly for the first time in your life. Because until you do that, nothing changes. You're just a con man running a new con this time on yourself." David's words carried weight precisely because he had nothing to gain from them. He wasn't family trying to reconcile. He wasn't a therapist being paid to help. He was someone successful and powerful who simply didn't tolerate their bullshit. And slowly, painfully, something began to shift, not dramatically, but genuinely. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like watching ice melt. You couldn't see it happening in real time, but over weeks you noticed the change. The first real sign came from Harold. 3 months into his community service, the shelter coordinator asked if he'd be willing to work overnight shifts. They were short-staffed, and Harold's reliability, he showed up on time, worked without complaining, made him a good candidate. He agreed, perhaps because he had nothing else to do with his evenings. On his 3rd overnight shift, he met a man named Robert Chen. The shared last name with my mother wasn't lost on me when Harold told me about it later, though it was pure coincidence. Robert was 58, well-spoken, and heartbreakingly aware of how far he'd fallen. Over the long, quiet hours of the night shift, while other residents slept on cots in the main room, Harold and Robert talked. Robert had been an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Cleveland. He'd lost his job during the 2008 recession, burned through his savings, couldn't find new work as he got older. A combination of bad luck, poor decisions, and a lack of safety net had landed him on the streets 5 years ago. "The worst part isn't the cold or the hunger," Robert told Harold that night. "It's the invisibility. People look right through you like you don't exist. Like you're not a person anymore, just a problem they step around." Harold told me later that those words hit him like a physical blow. That's what he'd done to me. For 22 years he'd looked right through me, rendered me invisible in my own home. I'd been a problem to step around, a responsibility to minimize, never a person worthy of being seen. When his shift ended at 6 in the morning, Harold sat in his old car in the parking lot and wept. Not the angry tears of self-pity he'd shed when they lost the house, but something different. Genuine remorse, perhaps for the first time in his life, for the specific harm he'd caused to a specific person who'd deserved so much better. He called me that afternoon. I almost didn't answer. "I met someone last night who reminded me of what I did to you," he said, his voice raw. "And I need you to know I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not because I'm scared of prison or because I want something from you, just because you deserved better, and I failed you." I didn't know what to say. The apology felt real in a way nothing else from him had, but I also knew that one moment of clarity didn't erase 22 years of cruelty. "Thank you for saying that," I said finally. "Keep doing the work." Margaret's breakthrough came differently, but just as unexpectedly. She'd been volunteering at the food bank for 4 months, still maintaining her emotional distance, still treating it like a chore to be endured. Then one Saturday, she was assigned to work with Doris Washington, a 63-year-old grandmother who'd recently taken in her 3 young grandchildren after her daughter died of an overdose. Doris talked while they packed food boxes, her voice matter-of-fact about tragedy that would have broken most people. She spoke about loving those children fiercely, about being exhausted, but committed about how they weren't hers, the way her daughter had been, but were hers in every way that mattered. "Love isn't about blood," Doris said, simply handing Margaret a bag of rice to pack. "It's about showing up every day and choosing them over and over, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Margaret told me later that something inside her shattered in that moment. She'd had me, a 5-year-old child who'd just lost her mother, who desperately needed love and stability and family. And instead of choosing me, instead of showing up for me, she'd chosen resentment and cruelty. She'd had 22 years to be the aunt her sister would have wanted her to be, and she'd failed at every single opportunity. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. Doris looked confused. "Honey, you didn't do anything wrong. You're doing great work here." But the apology wasn't for Doris. It was for me, for my mother, for the child she'd punished instead of loved. Margaret called me that evening, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "I didn't know how to love you," she sobbed. "I didn't know how to see past my jealousy of Sarah, and by the time I realized what I was doing, years had passed, and the distance felt permanent. I'm so sorry, Chelsea. I'm so desperately sorry." Like Harold's apology, I didn't know how to respond. Forgiveness felt premature, but I could hear genuine anguish in her voice that I'd never heard before. "Keep working on yourself," I said. "That's all I can ask right now." Justin's transformation was perhaps the most surprising because it came from discovering something he was actually good at. After David's visit, something had shifted in Justin's approach to the youth center. He started putting his phone away during sessions. He started actually listening when the teenagers talked. And he discovered almost by accident that he was good at helping them with homework. A 15-year-old named Marcus Daniels was struggling with algebra. His foster parents tried to help, but didn't understand the material themselves. Marcus was convinced he was too stupid for math and was on the verge of giving up. Justin, who'd always been decent at math even if he'd been lazy about everything else, offered to tutor him. What started as one session became weekly meetings. Justin learned how to explain concepts in different ways, how to be patient when Marcus didn't understand immediately, how to celebrate small victories when Marcus finally grasped a difficult problem. Marcus's grades improved from an F to a C, then to a B. His confidence grew. And one day, after finally understanding quadratic equations, Marcus looked at Justin and said, "You're the first person who made me feel like I could actually do this." Justin told me later that he'd felt something completely unfamiliar in that moment. Pride that wasn't based on being better than someone else or having more advantages than someone else. Pride that came from genuinely helping another person succeed. He started staying at the center beyond his required hours. He took on more students. The supervisor who'd reported his terrible attitude months earlier pulled him aside one day and said, "Whatever happened to you, keep it up. You're making a real difference here." Justin was becoming someone worth respecting, including to himself. I watched these transformations from a distance, getting updates from coordinators and therapists, seeing small signs of genuine change. Part of me wanted to believe it was real. Part of me remained skeptical, waiting for them to revert to their old patterns. Then David called me with information that changed everything again. "There's something else in the family records," he said, his voice careful. "Something I think you need to know about. It's about Justin." "What about him?" "Can you meet me tomorrow?" This isn't a conversation for the phone. My stomach dropped. "David, what did you find?" "Just trust me. Tomorrow. My office. There's one more secret your family has been keeping." But there was still one devastating truth left to uncover, one that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. I met David at his office the next morning, my mind racing through possibilities of what secret could possibly be left to uncover. We'd already exposed the trust fund, the welfare fraud, the adoption deception. What else could there be? David was sitting at his desk with a file folder in front of him. His expression was somber. "Before I show you this," he said carefully, "I need you to understand that I didn't go looking for it. Justin found it himself and came to me asking questions. I verified the information, and then I asked him if I could be the one to tell you." "Tell me what?" He opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. It was a birth certificate, old and slightly yellowed. The child's name, Justin Alexander Chen. Date of birth, March 15, 1999. Mother, Margaret Elizabeth Chen. Father, Marcus Chen. Not Patterson. Chen. "Justin isn't Harold's biological son," David said quietly. "Harold adopted him when he married Margaret." I stared at the document, my brain struggling to process. "Marcus Chen, that's—" "Sarah's brother," David confirmed. "Your uncle. Margaret was briefly married to him before she met Harold. The marriage was volatile. Marcus had substance abuse issues and became abusive. When Margaret got pregnant, Marcus abandoned her. He's been out of the picture since before Justin was born." The implications crashed over me like a wave. "Justin is my cousin." "Yes. You're both connected to Sarah Chen Yu as her daughter, him as her nephew. Your blood relatives actually related in a way you never were with Harold." I sat back in my chair, trying to reorganize everything I knew about my family dynamics through this new lens. "Does Justin know?" I asked. "He knows. He's the one who found the birth certificate while helping his parents sort documents for their bankruptcy filing. It was in a box labeled "Do Not Open." He confronted Margaret and she told him everything. David pulled out another document, adoption papers, showing Harold Patterson legally adopting Justin Alexander Chen in 2000 when Justin was 1 year old. "Harold raised Justin knowing he wasn't his biological son," David continued. "And I think that explains a lot about the family dynamics. Harold was trying to prove that his son, even adopted, was superior to Sarah's biological daughter. Every time he pushed Justin to be better than you, every time he favored Justin, he was fighting his own insecurity about not being Justin's biological father. The cruelty of it was staggering. Justin hadn't been loved for who he was. He'd been weaponized in Harold's psychological war against my mother's memory." "Where is Justin now?" I asked. "He asked if he could call you," David said. I told him I'd let you decide if you wanted to talk to him. I sat in silence for a long moment, processing 25 years of family dysfunction through this new understanding. Justin and I had both been pawns, both been damaged, both been used by adults who should have protected us. Tell him he can call me, I said finally. Justin called that evening. His voice was shaking. Did David tell you? He asked. Yes. I didn't know, he said quickly. I swear I didn't know. All these years I thought Harold was my biological father. I thought I was actually their son and you were the outsider. But we're both outsiders, I finished. We're both Sarah Chen's family, who got taken in by people who resented her. I'm so sorry, Chelsea. His voice cracked. I'm sorry for everything. The scholarship, the credit cards, the way I treated you. I know sorry isn't enough. No, it's not, I agreed. But I understand now. You were a kid being manipulated by adults who should have known better. We both were. We talked for 2 hours after that. Really talked for the first time in our lives. He told me about growing up with Harold's constant pressure to be exceptional. The impossible standards, the feeling that he was never quite good enough, no matter what he achieved. He told me about the confusion he'd felt watching me get treated so differently, knowing on some level it was wrong, but not understanding why it was happening. I told him about the loneliness, the invisibility, the years of believing something was fundamentally wrong with me. We were both victims of adults who'd weaponized us against each other. Harold had pitted us in competition to soothe his own insecurities. Margaret had treated me with cruelty because she couldn't separate me from her resentment of my mother. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving I'm better than who they raised me to be, Justin said finally. So will I said quietly. For the first time, I felt something like kinship with my brother, not the fake family bond we'd been told we had, but a real connection forged from shared trauma and the choice to be better. There's one more thing, Justin said hesitantly. Mom wants to see you, to tell you everything. No more lies, no more secrets. She says she's ready to be completely honest about everything about Sarah, about why she did what she did, all of it. But she wanted me to ask you first if you'd be willing to hear it. I closed my eyes, exhausted by revelation after revelation. Okay, I said finally. Tell her I'll meet her. One last time. And then Mom asked to see me one final time to tell me the whole truth. No more lies. We met in a small park near the Lake Neutral territory on a cold November afternoon. Margaret was already sitting on a bench when I arrived, wrapped in a thin coat that had seen better days. She looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of consequences, and what I hoped was genuine reflection. I sat down next to her but kept distance between us. You said you wanted to tell me everything. I do. Her voice was quiet, steady. No more lies. No more excuses. You deserve to know the whole truth about why I did what I did. She stared out at the gray water of Lake Erie, gathering her thoughts, or maybe her courage. Sarah and I were close when we were little, Margaret began. I was 6 years younger, and I adored her. She was brilliant, funny, kind. Everyone loved her. But as we got older, that admiration turned into something uglier. She twisted her hands in her lap, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from her before. Sarah excelled at everything. She got straight A's without trying while I struggled to pass. She got a full scholarship to Berkeley while I barely got into community college. She started a business with David and became successful while I was working as a bank teller, living paycheck to paycheck. Our parents compared us constantly. Why can't you be more like Sarah? Sarah would never do that. Sarah is going places. I'd heard versions of this before, but there was something different in Margaret's voice now. Not defensiveness or self-pity, but genuine pain. The jealousy ate away at me for years, she continued. Every time Sarah succeeded at something, it felt like proof that I was a failure. When she got sick, I visited her once in the hospital. I thought seeing her weak and dying would make me feel better, would finally make us equal. Her voice broke slightly. "But even dying, she was graceful and strong. She talked about you, about making sure you'd be okay. She had this dignity that illness couldn't touch. And I hated her for it. I hated that she was better than me even at dying." I sat perfectly still, letting her continue. "When she asked me to take you after she died, I saw it as an opportunity." Margaret said the words coming faster now, like she needed to get them out. "Finally, I could have something of Sarah's. I could control it, shape it, diminish it. It sounds monstrous saying it out loud, but that's the truth. I never wanted to love you, Chelsea. I wanted to own you." She finally looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "I sabotaged you at every turn. I installed spyware on your laptop to monitor you. I read your emails. When you got scholarship notifications, I contacted the committees and told them you had behavioral problems, that you were unstable. I called your community college advisor and said you were dealing with family emergencies, so they'd stop offering you opportunities. I threw away acceptance letters from universities when you were 18. My breath caught. "Acceptance letters?" "3 of them," Margaret whispered. "You were accepted to Ohio State University of Cincinnati and Case Western, all with partial scholarships. I intercepted the mail and destroyed them before you could see them. The theft was so complete, so thorough, that I felt dizzy with the scope of it. I was terrified you'd become like her," Margaret continued, "that you'd succeed and prove that Sarah was right to be confident, right to be proud, right to take up space in the world. And that would mean I was wrong about everything, wrong to be jealous, wrong to be small, wrong to spend my life resenting her instead of learning from her." She was sobbing now, her careful composure completely shattered. "So I tried to break you. I tried to make you believe you were worthless so you'd never reach for anything better. But I couldn't do it. You have her strength, her resilience, her refusal to be diminished. And every time you succeeded despite me, it made me hate you more." The honesty was brutal and raw and long overdue. "I don't expect forgiveness," Margaret said finally. "I don't deserve it. I just needed you to know that it was never your fault. Everything wrong between us, every cruel thing I did that was my sickness, my jealousy, my failure, not yours. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." I sat with those words for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. And with understanding came a kind of liberation. "You're right," I said finally. "You don't deserve forgiveness." Margaret nodded, accepting the judgment. "But I'm going to give it to you anyway," I continued. "Not because of who you are or what you've done to earn it, but because of who I choose to be." I stood up, looking down at this woman who'd caused me so much pain. "I forgive you for me, not for you," I said clearly. "So I can move forward without carrying your poison around inside me. So I can be free of the need for your approval or the hope that you'll somehow transform into the mother figure I needed. I'm done waiting for something you'll never be able to give." Margaret looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and devastation. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation," I continued. "It doesn't mean we'll have Sunday dinners or exchange birthday cards, or that I'll ever call you Mom again. It means I'm releasing you from my life while releasing myself from yours. We'll always be connected legally through Justin, through shared history. But we're not family. We're just 2 people who survived the same dysfunction and are choosing different paths forward." I picked up my bag, ready to walk away. "Thank you for finally telling me the truth," I said. "I hope it helps you find some peace." And then I made my final decision about their fate, one that would define all of our futures. 2 weeks after that conversation with Margaret, I sat down with David's attorney to make my final decision about criminal prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming. The charges were solid. Any prosecutor would take this case and win. Margaret, Harold, and Justin could all face significant prison time for welfare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. But sending them to prison wouldn't heal me. It wouldn't give me back my childhood or the opportunities they'd stolen. And more importantly, I'd watched them begin to change, haltingly, imperfectly, but genuinely. "I'm not pressing criminal charges," I told the attorney, "but I have conditions." We drafted a legal agreement over the next week. It was thorough binding and designed to ensure they faced real consequences while being given a genuine chance at redemption. First condition: Margaret and Harold would enter into a court-approved repayment plan with the state of Ohio and the IRS. Every dollar of the $216,000 in welfare fraud plus penalties and back taxes would be repaid over the next 10 years. The monthly payments would be significant enough to ensure they lived modestly, worked hard, and never forgot what they'd done. But it would be manageable if they committed to it. Second condition: they would continue therapy and community service for a minimum of 2 years. Not the 6 months I'd originally demanded, but genuine long-term engagement with the work of transformation. Their therapist and service coordinators would provide quarterly reports. Any indication they were going through the motions rather than genuinely engaging, and the deal was void. Third condition: they would sign legal documents relinquishing any claim now or ever to my inheritance, my assets, or any financial support from me. They would also agree to never contact me without my explicit permission. If I wanted to reach out, I would. But they had no right to demand my time, my presence, or my forgiveness beyond what I'd already given. For Justin, the terms were different. He was younger, he'd shown genuine remorse, and I believed his transformation was more complete than his parents'. I agreed to work with prosecutors to get his identity theft charges reduced to a pretrial diversion program. He'd have to complete community service, continue therapy, and maintain steady employment for 2 years. If he did that, the charges would be expunged from his record. We all signed the agreements in David's conference room. It felt like a divorce more than a resolution, a formal severing of ties that had been poisonous for too long. Afterward, I gathered them one last time to make my boundaries absolutely clear. "I want you to understand something," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "I'm not your daughter, your niece, or your family in any meaningful sense anymore. That door closed years ago. You're people I'm giving a chance to rebuild your lives, but we're not rebuilding together." Harold started to protest, but I held up my hand. "You'll do this work for yourselves, not for me," I continued. "Not to win me back or earn my love or prove something to me. You'll do it because it's the right thing to do, because you want to be better people, because you finally understand that your actions have consequences." I stood up ready to leave. If in 5 years you've genuinely transformed, if you've paid your debts, done the work, become people who contribute to the world instead of taking from it, you can reach out. I'll consider responding, but I make no promises. My life moves forward with or without you. Margaret was crying again, but quietly. Harold looked defeated but resigned. Justin nodded, accepting the terms. "This is the most mercy you're going to get from me," I said finally. "Use it wisely." Then I turned my attention to the trust fund that had been waiting for me for 21 years. $7.8 million. Life-changing money. Money that could buy houses, cars, luxury, ease. But I'd already built a successful career. I had financial security from my own work. I didn't need this money for survival, so I decided to use it the way my mother would have wanted. I established the Sarah Chen Foundation with $6 million of the inheritance. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide scholarships, legal aid, and therapy services to foster children, adopted children, and young people escaping abusive family situations. Kids like I had been. Kids who needed someone to see them, believe in them, and give them the tools to build better lives. At the foundation's launch event 6 months later, I stood before a room full of donors, social workers, and the first scholarship recipients and explained why this mattered so much. "My mother couldn't save me directly," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion in my chest. "She died when I was 5, and the people who were supposed to honor her wishes chose cruelty instead. But her legacy, the money she earned, the partnership she built, the values she lived by, that's saving hundreds of young people now. That's the real inheritance she left. Not money, but the power to break cycles of abuse and give kids a chance at better futures. The remaining $1.8 million I invested carefully, ensuring financial security for myself and creating an endowment that would allow the foundation to grow and expand its reach over decades. I'd taken the pain they'd caused me and transformed it into purpose. I'd turned their cruelty into my calling. That felt like the truest form of justice. 3 years later, I discovered whether their transformation was real or just another performance. 3 years passed faster than I expected. I'd relocated to San Francisco, accepting David's offer to become Chief Strategy Officer at Whitmore Enterprises. Working alongside him felt right. He'd become the father figure I'd never had, the mentor who saw my potential and helped me realize it without demanding anything in return. The Sarah Chen Foundation exceeded every goal I'd set for it. In 3 years, we'd served over 500 young people, providing scholarships to kids aging out of foster care, legal advocacy for adopted children in abusive situations, and therapy services for young people escaping family trauma. Every scholarship awarded, every life changed, felt like honoring my mother's memory while rewriting the story she couldn't finish. My personal life had transformed too. I'd met Marcus Chen, yes, that surname again, though this Marcus was a civil rights attorney with no connection to my family at a foundation fundraiser. He was kind, stable, and loved me without trying to fix me or save me. He understood that I had already saved myself and just wanted to walk alongside me as I continued building the life I deserved. My apartment in Pacific Heights was small but beautiful, filled with light streaming through large windows. Plants lined the sills. Photographs covered the walls, not of the Pattersons, but of people I'd chosen: David at the foundation launch, Marcus and me at the Golden Gate Bridge, the first 3 scholarship recipients who'd become like younger sisters to me. For the first time in my life, I felt at home in my own skin. The Pattersons, according to the quarterly reports I received from their therapist and the payment tracking system, were making progress. Harold worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. Margaret was a home health aide caring for elderly patients. Justin had found steady work as an IT support specialist at a nonprofit serving homeless youth. They were living modestly in their 2-bedroom apartment, making their monthly payments to the state and IRS without fail. By all external metrics, they'd changed their lives. But when Justin sent me an email 6 months ago asking if I'd attend his wedding, I saw the limitations of that change. "I'm getting married in September," he wrote. "Her name is Rebecca, and I met her volunteering at the youth center. I know we haven't talked much, but it would mean a lot to Mom and Dad to see you there. They've worked so hard to earn your forgiveness, and I think it would show them that their efforts weren't in vain. Still centering their feelings, still asking me to perform for their comfort, to validate their journey by my presence." I declined politely and sent a generous gift. True transformation takes longer than 3 years, maybe a lifetime. And I wasn't responsible for witnessing or validating their growth. Then came the Foundation's 3rd annual gala. We'd rented a beautiful ballroom overlooking the bay. 300 donors, supporters, board members, and scholarship recipients filled the space. I'd been asked to give the keynote speech, to share my story publicly for the first time. Standing at that podium, looking out at all those faces, I told them everything. About Sarah Chen, the brilliant woman who'd co-founded a company and then died too young. About the Pattersons who'd taken me in and spent 20 years trying to break me. About the inheritance they'd hidden, the opportunities they'd sabotaged, the cruelty they'd justified. And about the choice I'd made to transform that pain into purpose. My mother couldn't protect me from what happened after she died. I said, my voice carrying through the room. But her legacy, her intelligence, her values, her partnership with David gave me the resources to protect hundreds of other young people. That's the real inheritance. Not money, but the power to break cycles and create change. The applause was thunderous. People stood. Some were crying. Afterward, as I moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and thanking donors, I noticed 3 people standing at the very back of the ballroom: Margaret, Harold, and Justin. They hadn't approached the VIP section. They hadn't tried to talk to me or insert themselves into my evening. They simply stood there, dressed in their modest best, watching. When my eyes met Margaret's across the crowded room, she raised her hand slightly and mouthed 2 words. "I'm sorry." Not asking for anything, not expecting anything, just acknowledging what she'd done and what I'd become despite her. I nodded slightly acknowledgement, not absolution, and turned back to the donor I was speaking with. They stayed for the entire gala. Through the dinner, the auction, the dancing. They watched me shine in a world they'd tried to keep me from. Watched me surrounded by people who valued and respected me, watched me living the life they'd attempted to destroy. And then when the evening ended, they quietly left without trying to speak to me. It was perhaps the most honest thing they'd ever done, witnessing my success without making it about themselves. That night, I sat in my apartment with the people who mattered. David, who'd given me truth when I needed it most. Marcus, who loved me without conditions. And 3 young women from the foundation, Jasmine, Keisha, and Maria, who'd become like the sisters I'd never had. We talked about the gala, laughed about the awkward rich donors, made plans for expanding the foundation's reach into other cities. David raised his glass. "To Sarah Chen," he said, his voice warm with affection, "who built a legacy of brilliant women." We all drank to that. I felt my mother's presence then, not as grief or loss, but as gratitude and connection. She'd given me the foundation to build this life, even if she couldn't be here to see it. I'd finally found what I'd searched for all those years in the Patterson house. Not in blood or obligation, but in choice and love. These people sitting in my living room, they were my family. The young people whose lives the foundation changed, they were my purpose. The work I did every day, transforming pain into protection, that was my mother's true legacy. The Pattersons had 7 years left on their repayment plan. Maybe a lifetime left on their journey toward becoming people worthy of a relationship with me. But that was their path to walk, not mine to validate. I'd already found my way home. Some families are born, others are chosen, and some must earn their way back, one honest step at a time. I'd finally found mine in the foundation, in David's mentorship, in the young people whose lives I could change, and in the simple truth that love is a verb, not a noun. The Pattersons had 3 years left on their repayment plan, maybe a lifetime left on their journey to becoming people worthy of a relationship. But me, I was already home. If this story moved you, if Chelsea's journey from invisible to unstoppable resonated with your own experiences of overcoming family dysfunction or finding your chosen family, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories of real people breaking cycles, choosing healing over bitterness, and transforming pain into purpose, are what this channel is all about. Your subscription tells me these stories matter to you, and it helps this message reach others who need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles. But here's what I really want to know. What would you have done in Chelsea's position? Would you have offered the Pattersons a chance at redemption, or would you have pursued full prosecution? Do you think Margaret, Harold, and Justin truly changed, or were they just performing to avoid prison? And most importantly, have you ever had to set boundaries with toxic family members and build your own chosen family? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories often inspire the next videos I create. Remember, the families we're born into don't define us. The families we choose, the values we live by, and the legacy we build, that's what matters. Chelsea understood that. Her mother understood that. And now, hopefully, you understand that too. Sometimes the greatest act of love is loving yourself enough to walk away from people who can't see your worth. Thank you for listening to Chelsea's story. Until next time, choose yourself, choose growth, and choose the family that chooses you back.